Hello, curious minds, and welcome to Documentary for Sleep. If you've ever wondered why, beneath our layers of art, empathy, and civilization, violence still runs through our species, you're not alone. Maybe you've seen it on the news, in history books, or even in yourself. Those flashes of aggression that seem both deeply human and disturbingly ancient. Whether you're lying in bed, letting this play as you drift toward sleep, or listening quietly while you cook, study, or take a late-night walk, this space is here for slowing down and reflecting. Tonight, we're not stepping into fantasy, but into biology and evolution, into the story of how violence became part of our inheritance. We'll look back at our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, to see why one mirrors our darker side, while the other leans toward peace. We'll pause with the chemistry of the brain, testosterone, neural circuits, the sparks that fire when aggression takes hold. This is soft science, not speculation, grounded in anthropology, neuroscience, and evolutionary history. We don't claim to have all the answers, but we do have the questions, the fossils and the patterns that whisper why Homo sapiens can be both compassionate and cruel. And if you drift off before we reach the end, that's completely fine. I've left full timestamps in the description so you can return tomorrow and pick up where you left off, because this story is worth hearing all the way through. If you find comfort in this kind of quiet, long-form exploration, if it helps you learn, focus, or just feel less alone in a noisy world, consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps this channel reach more curious sapiens like you. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And how do you use this channel? In bed before sleep, at work, or somewhere far away during a night shift? As always, stay curious, stay calm. The African sun bakes the earth, a relentless and ancient eye. In the golden grass, a stillness is broken only by the subtle shift of a predator's muscle. Then, a blur of spotted energy, a burst of dust, and a final, breathless sigh. The leopard's teeth find the gazelle's neck not out of malice, but out of necessity. This is not a scene of cruelty. It is a transaction as old as life itself, written in the stark language of survival. For millions of years, the world operated on this simple, brutal economy. To live, something else must die. And we, the human animal, are heirs to this bloody inheritance. Our earliest ancestors stepped onto this stage already versed in its harsh rhythms. Homo habilis, the handyman, learned to turn sharp stone into a key for unlocking nutrients from a carcass. They were scavengers first, carving opportunities from the leavings of bigger, faster predators. But with each successful cut, a new neural pathway fired. The rich, dense calories of meat did more than fill a stomach. They fed a growing brain, fueling a cognitive revolution. The act of pursuit, of coordinated takedowns, forged not just stronger muscles, but stronger social bonds. The hunt became a cradle for culture, for communication, for strategy. It asked the first profound questions. Where is the prey? How do we outthink it? How do we work together to transform a living creature into a shared meal? This primal partnership between violence and community is etched deep into our bones, a ghost in our genetic machine. We no longer roam the savannah, our survival hinging on the day's catch. Our food comes packaged, sterilized, and disconnected from the life it once was. Yet the old wiring remains, humming with a low voltage. It flickers to life in the modern arena, in the visceral thrill of a violent video game where we are the virtual hunter, in the orchestrated chaos of an action film, in the quiet, competitive hunger for dominance in a boardroom. We have sublimated the hunt, channeling that ancient drive into rituals and metaphors. The satisfaction of a closed deal can feel, in some deep, unspoken way, like a successful stalk. The urge to conquer, to outperform, to acquire. Are these not the echoes of a time when the ultimate prize was a full belly and the right to see another sunrise? But this inheritance is a double-edged sword, a tool that built us and one that can unmade us. The same instinct that taught us to collaborate to bring down a mammoth could be turned inward against our own. If killing to eat is a biological imperative, a script written by evolution, then what strange and terrible twist of consciousness allows us to so willingly turn that same violence upon our own kind? What happens when the most dangerous predator on the plains is no longer the leopard in the grass, but the figure standing next to you, who shares your language, your fears, and your capacity for harm? The rules of the ancient game change entirely when the prey wears your own face. A tiger knows the invisible lines that mark its world. It moves through the jungle with a map of scent and memory, giving a wide berth to the territory of another. There is a distance, a buffer of understood danger, that keeps the peace. But in the world of humans, there are no such lines. Our most profound threat does not lurk in the shadows of an alien forest. It sits across the table, shares our language, and wears a familiar face. Our own kind is the most dangerous predator we will ever know. This is not a uniquely human tragedy, but a brutal thread woven deep into the fabric of the natural world. For many of the planet's most social and territorial creatures, the greatest violence is not inflicted by a different species. It is a civil war. The majority of killings occur within the same species, a grim statistic that challenges our romantic notions of nature. It is not about sustenance, not about an empty stomach driving a hunt. It is about power, about control, about the raw calculus of genes seeking an advantage. This internal conflict is most acute not in the solitary wanderers, but in those animals who, like us, build complex societies with rules, hierarchies, and coveted resources. Consider our closest genetic cousins, the chimpanzees. For decades, they were seen as our peaceful, arboreal cousins. But science has peeled back the canopy to reveal a darker narrative. Researchers have documented chimpanzee tribes engaging in what can only be described as calculated warfare. Patrols of males will silently stalk the borders of their territory. When they encounter a lone individual or a smaller group from a rival community, the outcome is not a display of bluster. It is a coordinated, brutal attack, an ambush of overwhelming force that ends in death. The motivation is chillingly pragmatic: to eliminate competition, to expand territory, to gain access to more food and more mates. This is not random violence. It is a strategic, repeated behavior, a grim inheritance. We look at this and see a distorted mirror. The pattern echoes through our own history, a relentless drumbeat from our deepest past to our complex present. In ancient tribal lands, men hunted other men as they would prey, for resources, for status, for security. This primordial competition scaled up, morphing, but never truly changing its essence. The sprawling modern battlefield, with its technological terror, is still fundamentally about control, territory, and hierarchy. The weapons evolve from clubs to drones, but the underlying impulse, the elimination of the rival tribe, remains a haunting constant. We have civilized the world, but have we civilized this ancient, bloody logic that resides within our own nature? This presents a profound and unsettling paradox. If violence against an outsider can be rationalized by the cold equations of survival, more land, more food, a safer future for one's group, then what does that say about the nature of community itself? We are drawn together for safety, for companionship, for the strength of the collective. Yet it is this very closeness, this intimate understanding of the same desires and fears, that can fuel the most precise and personal forms of cruelty. The enemy is not a mysterious monster. It is the one who knows you best. The line between neighbor and threat becomes terrifyingly thin. So if the capacity for such violence is etched into our biology, a shared legacy with the natural world, does that make it an inevitable sentence? Or does our unique awareness of it become the very tool to forge a different path? We built walls to keep the tigers out, only to find the true danger was already inside, building with us. Is the intimacy of our own societies the very thing that makes such darkness possible? Perhaps the most extreme expression of this internal conflict is not in the killing of rivals, but in the unthinkable, the harm of one's own young. When the drive to perpetuate a genetic legacy twists back on itself and the cradle becomes a site of sacrifice, the new lion stands atop the rocky outcrop, his mane dark against the setting sun. The air, thick with the scent of dust and blood, carries the faint cries of the defeated. The vanquished males have fled. Now the victor surveys his hard-won kingdom. His first act as king will not be to mate, to feast, or to rest. It will be to seek out the cubs, the living legacy of his rivals. One by one, he will find them and kill them. To our eyes, it is a scene of profound and shocking cruelty, a violation of the most sacred natural law. Yet for him, it is simply the next logical step. This is infanticide, and it is woven into the very fabric of life on Earth. To witness a mother's grief in the animal kingdom is to stare into an abyss. A langur monkey clutches her dead infant, refusing to let go for days. A dolphin mother pushes her lifeless calf through the water, a somber procession in the vast blue. We see tragedy. We see a failure of nature's nurturing heart. But the cold calculus of evolution often operates in a register far removed from our own emotions. What we perceive as a monstrous aberration is, in fact, a widespread strategy. It is documented in over a quarter of all mammalian species, from the great apes to the smallest rodents, a dark thread running through the tapestry of the natural world. The driving force behind this behavior is not malice, but a brutal genetic imperative. For the new Lion King, the cubs are not innocent young. They are a drain on the future. Their mothers will continue to nurse them, delaying their return to fertility. By eliminating them, the male swiftly brings the females into estrus, ready to bear his own offspring. He trades the potential genes of another for the certainty of his own. He is not destroying the future. He is ruthlessly seizing it, ensuring his lineage is the one that echoes through time. This same strategy plays out in chimpanzee troops, where males often kill the infants of outside females, and in prairie dog colonies, where a female might destroy her neighbor's pups to reduce competition for her own. It is a grim investment in a genetic tomorrow. This biological reality holds up a disquieting mirror to our own history. In human societies, violence against children is the crime that shocks us most deeply, the ultimate betrayal. Yet, our past is stained with its own forms of infanticide. In cultures across the globe and throughout time, newborns who were deformed, who were weak, who were born into impossible circumstances, or simply who were the wrong gender, were exposed to the elements or otherwise eliminated. This was often framed as a necessity for the survival of the family or the tribe, a desperate act to conserve scarce resources. In other cases, it was sanctified by ritual, a child offered to appease a capricious god. Were these acts purely cultural, or did they tap into the same deep, ancient well of hard choices that shaped the rest of the animal kingdom? We like to imagine a clear line separating us, the moral and reasoning beings, from them, the creatures of pure instinct. We console ourselves with the idea that our compassion is our evolution, but if the impulse to ensure one's own genetic success can manifest in such a devastating act, a question whispers from the shadows of our DNA. That deep, primal wiring for survival and propagation is our shared inheritance. So, what remains of that legacy within us? Does a fragment of that ancient, terrible calculus still linger in the darkest corners of our psyche, a ghost of a choice we once, as a species, might have made? If this darkness is one potential outcome of our evolutionary journey, what of its opposite? What of peace? Imagine two worlds, separated only by a river. On one bank, a society where power is seized through violence, where males form alliances to hunt, to dominate, and to kill their own kind. On the opposite bank, a society where conflicts are soothed with an embrace, where females hold the ultimate authority, and where sharing is the norm, not the exception. This is not a philosophical thought experiment. This is the reality of our closest living relatives, the chimpanzee and the bonobo, two apes who walked away from a common ancestor and chose radically different paths. One chose the club, the other, the cradle. They are a mirror, separated by the Congo River, reflecting back at us a profound and unsettling duality. We look at them, and in their distinct social contracts, we see the ghost of our own evolutionary choices. The story of these two apes is a scientific parable, a narrative etched in DNA and behavior, asking us where we ourselves belong on this spectrum between conflict and compassion. It is a tale that begins not with a bang, but with a geological event, the formation of that mighty river over 1 million years ago, which irrevocably split a population and set them on their separate journeys. The chimpanzee's world is one of scarcity and strategy. North of the river, resources were unpredictable, food was often limited, and competition was fierce. In this crucible, natural selection forged a creature of formidable intelligence and brutal pragmatism. Chimpanzee society is a political landscape of shifting male alliances, a constant negotiation for power and status. They engage in coordinated hunting parties, chasing down red colobus monkeys with a terrifying efficiency. But their violence is not reserved for prey alone. They are known to wage what can only be called war. Patrols of males will venture to the edges of their territory, and if they encounter a lone male from a rival group, they will attack with a chilling, coordinated ferocity. This is not random aggression. It is a calculated tactic to reduce the strength of neighboring communities, to expand their own territory, and to secure more resources. Their social bonds, deep and affectionate among allies, are the very glue that enables this organized aggression. The same hand that gently grooms a friend can, in a different context, become a weapon. Cross the river, and you enter the bonobos' realm. South of the Congo, the forests were and are lush and abundant. The evolutionary pressure was less about fighting for survival, and more about managing social cohesion in a world of plenty. In this garden, a different kind of society blossomed. Bonobo life is orchestrated by females, who form powerful coalitions that suppress male aggression. They are the peacekeepers, the mediators, the ultimate authority. And their tool for maintaining this utopia is one of the most powerful forces in biology: sexuality. For bonobos, sex is a social currency, a handshake, a peace treaty, and a tension release valve. It is used to greet one another, to resolve disputes over food, to reconcile after a squabble, and to strengthen female bonds. A tense moment at a fruit tree doesn't end with a fight. It dissolves into a flurry of genital rubbing and mating. Their world is one of empathy, play, and a promiscuity that erases social tension. The same drive that, in other species, is a source of conflict becomes, for the bonobo, the foundation of peace. We stand between these two mirrors, genetically almost equidistant from both. Our DNA whispers of a shared history with the chimpanzee, a thread of common ancestry that feels undeniable when we witness the dark chapters of human history. Our own wars, our genocides, our capacity for cruelty and territorial violence. We see the chimpanzee's political machinations in our boardrooms and our governments. Yet we also feel the bonobo's pull. We see it in our acts of incredible altruism, in our capacity for empathy that extends to strangers, in our moments of shared laughter and tenderness. We are a paradoxical species, capable of creating breathtaking art and devastating weapons, of nurturing life and orchestrating death. We contain both the potential for the patrol and the potential for the picnic. So which ape are we? The answer is not written in our stars, but in our circumstances. The chimp and the bonobo show us that our nature is not a fixed, monolithic destiny. It is a repertoire of possibilities, a set of tools honed by evolution. The environment, the structure of our society, the values of our culture, the lessons of our education, acts as the conductor, determining which part of our orchestra plays the loudest melody. Do we create societies that reward aggression and competition, that breed scarcity and fear, effectively coaxing our inner chimp to the forefront? Or do we build cultures that value cooperation and empathy, that foster abundance and security, creating a space where our inner bonobo can thrive? We carry both legacies within us, a biological inheritance of conflict and resolution. The question is not which one is our true nature, but rather, which one do we choose to feed? Do we look across the river of our own potential and see a foe to be eliminated, or a neighbor to be embraced? The two apes offer no easy answers, only a reflection. They show us that the path we walk is not predetermined by our genes, but paved by the world we build for ourselves. And so we are left to wonder, if our environment is the switch that flips between these two ancient scripts, what does the world we've built say about the story we are choosing to tell? But then, a whisper from biology suggests that the script itself might have been written long before we ever picked up the pen. If our societies can amplify certain tendencies, where do those tendencies originally come from? Is the capacity for violence itself etched into the very code of our being? A stubborn, genetic heirloom we cannot seem to discard? Imagine two people in the same frustrating situation. One takes a deep breath, finds a logical solution, and moves on. The other's vision narrows, their fists clench, and the world reduces to a single, red-hot point of conflict. It's a divide we've all witnessed. What if the chasm between that calm resolution and that explosive reaction isn't just a matter of choice or upbringing, but is written, in part, in a language as old as life itself? What if the propensity for violence is nestled deep within our very blueprint, a silent whisper in our genes waiting for the right or wrong conditions to speak? This is not a question of simple destiny, but of complex biology. For decades, scientists have sifted through the human genome, searching for clues to our most primal behaviors. Their search has led them to a particular gene, one that has garnered a dramatic and perhaps unfairly simplistic nickname, the warrior gene. Officially known as MAOA, monoamine oxidase A, this gene doesn't code for aggression itself. Instead, it holds the instructions for building an enzyme, a meticulous janitor for the brain. This enzyme's crucial job is to clean up neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, chemical messengers integral to mood, pleasure, and, most importantly, emotional regulation. It sweeps away the excess, maintaining a delicate chemical balance that allows for clear thought and measured response. But sometimes the instructions are different. A common variant of this gene, known as MAOAL, results in a less efficient version of this neural custodian. The cleanup is slower. When a person with this variant experiences stress, threat, or provocation, the neurotransmitters can surge and linger like a gathering storm. Dopamine, associated with reward and arousal, may spike and persist. Serotonin, crucial for maintaining a stable mood, fails to be properly reabsorbed. The result is not a guaranteed explosion, but a lowered threshold. It's a neurological landscape that is quicker to flood, where emotional waves rise faster and recede more slowly. The internal compass that guides most people away from rage is, for them, more easily scrambled. To stop here, however, would be to tell only half the story, and the lesser half at that. The discovery of MAOAL sparked a dangerous temptation toward genetic determinism, the idea that our fates are sealed in our DNA. The truth, as nature so often insists, is far more intricate and profound. The warrior gene does not work in isolation. It is not a switch, but a dial, and the hand that turns it is the environment. This gene's expression is a classic and powerful example of a gene-environment interaction. It requires a trigger. Studies have shown that for individuals with the MAOAL variant, a childhood etched with trauma, abuse, or relentless violence dramatically increases the odds of antisocial and violent behavior later in life. The genetic predisposition finds its purpose in the crucible of adversity. The brain, shaped by early terror, learns that the world is a hostile place and that hypervigilance and aggression are necessary tools for survival. The slower enzymatic cleanup combines with a nervous system permanently tuned to high alert, a potentially volatile combination. Yet, the very same studies reveal the other side of the coin. A person with the exact same genetic variant, raised in a stable, supportive, and nurturing environment, shows no increased propensity for violence whatsoever. The gene lies dormant, a silent, unread paragraph in the story of their life. The potential is there, but it is never unlocked. The gun is loaded, but the safety remains on. This duality forces us to confront an uncomfortable mirror. Our justice systems, our media narratives, even our casual conversations often crave simplicity. the bad seed theory, the evil monster born, not made. The MAOA gene complicates this picture beyond easy repair. It is true that this variant appears more frequently in studies of violent criminals. Yet, it is also true that millions of people walk among us, carrying this same genetic signature, who have never raised a hand in anger. They are teachers, artists, engineers, and caregivers. They are not warriors. They are our neighbors. So, do we blame the gene, or do we blame the world that taught the gene how to behave? Can we truly condemn a man for a predisposition that only blossomed into violence when nurtured by neglect and brutality? To blame the gene alone is to ignore the gardener who chose to plant in barren, poisoned soil. This interplay between the innate and the experienced reframes the very architecture of behavior. We are not built on a foundation of stone, but of something more fluid and responsive. Our genetic code provides the raw materials, the clay, the iron, the glass. But it is our experiences, our relationships, the very culture we inhabit that sculpts those materials into form. The genetic predisposition is the foundation, but it is the environment and our conscious choices that build the house upon it. A weak foundation may necessitate more careful construction, but it does not dictate whether the house becomes a sanctuary or a prison. This leads us to an unsettling and perhaps unavoidable question about the nature of our collective existence. If the potential for violence sleeps within our biology, waiting for the right conditions to awaken, then what happens to a society under pressure? When the threads of community fray, when economic despair becomes a constant hum, when fear is used as a tool and uncertainty is the only certainty, are we not, in effect, creating the perfect environment for those latent tendencies to stir? Are we watering the seeds of aggression on a societal scale and then acting surprised when they grow? If our biology holds such a delicate balance, a recipe that can be altered by the world outside, then what responsibility do we bear for the chemistry within us all? And what happens when that chemistry is pushed to its limit? Have you ever considered that a single fleeting glance, a flash of eye contact loaded with perceived disrespect, could alter the very chemistry of your blood? That within minutes your body could be humming with a hormone that sharpens the edges of the world, priming you not for reason, but for conflict? This is not a metaphor. It is a biological reality. Testosterone, often simplistically branded the aggression molecule, surges in response to social challenges, a silent, potent shift that can turn a misunderstanding into a slap, and a slap into something far, far worse. This is the hidden physiology of a grudge, the unspoken recipe for rage. Violence, we often believe, is a decision, a moral failing, a conscious choice made in a moment of passion. But what if it is also, and perhaps more fundamentally, an intricate biological performance, a symphony of electrical impulses and chemical signals where the line between an instinct and an action becomes terrifyingly thin? The stage for this internal drama is deep within the most ancient corridors of our brain. The amygdala, two almond-shaped clusters of neurons, acts as a relentless sentry, constantly scanning the world for threats. It is the neural seat of fear, of anger, of visceral, gut-level hostility. When it perceives a challenge, a raised voice, a clenched fist, a dismissive smirk, it doesn't ponder. It reacts. It sounds an alarm that echoes through the body, triggering a cascade of stress hormones like cortisol and, yes, testosterone. This is the primal ignition switch, but we are not mere prisoners of this ancient circuitry. Standing in check, a more recent evolutionary development exerts a calming, rational influence, the prefrontal cortex. This is the cerebral commander, the seat of executive function, impulse control, and long-term consequence. It is the voice that urges you to count to 10, to walk away, to consider the fallout. Violence, then, in its most clinical sense, is not merely the amygdala roaring. It is the amygdala roaring while the prefrontal cortex falls silent. It is the collapse of the negotiation between our ancient animal self and our modern, civilized mind. This delicate balance is easily disrupted. Chronic stress acts like a constant, dull ache, wearing down the prefrontal cortex's ability to govern. Sleep deprivation, substance abuse, or even a traumatic brain injury can weaken its command, leaving the amygdala with less and less opposition. In this state of neural disinhibition, the threshold for violence plummets. A minor irritation becomes an intolerable provocation. The body is flooded with a chemical cocktail that screams of threat and urgency. Testosterone, in this nuanced view, is not the villainous puppeteer pulling the strings of aggression. It is more like a lens, focusing perception onto potential threats and amplifying the perceived need for a dominant, preemptive response. It makes the world feel more adversarial, turning a neutral face into a sneer and a casual remark into a grave insult. It is the biological undercurrent for the feeling of being disrespected, a sensation that has sparked countless conflicts throughout human history. We can see this intricate dance of chemicals and behavior reflected not just in our own species, but across the animal kingdom. In laboratory studies, a male monkey's place in the social hierarchy is written in his neurochemistry. The dominant male, constantly vigilant against challengers, maintains a high level of testosterone. Yet, if you artificially manipulate serotonin levels, another key neurotransmitter, in a rodent, you can directly dial its aggression up or down. A mouse with low serotonin becomes a hyper-aggressive fighter. Restore its levels, and it calms. This is not just animal curiosity. In humans, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, the most common type of antidepressant, are often prescribed to treat disorders of impulse control, including explosive rage. They work by making more serotonin available in the neural synapses, effectively strengthening the brain's natural braking system. This profound cross-species similarity suggests a deeply conserved neural toolkit for aggression. The same basic chemical currencies, testosterone, cortisol, serotonin, are traded in the brains of mice, monkeys, and men, buying and selling the impulse to fight. It forces us to ask, is our civility merely a thin veneer, a fragile state maintained by the precise levels of a few key molecules circulating in our brains? This is a deeply unsettling proposition. It challenges the very foundation of our legal and moral systems, which are built on the concept of free will and rational choice. If a violent act is the product of a hypervigilant amygdala, a weakened prefrontal cortex, a surge of testosterone, and a drop in serotonin, where does personal responsibility reside? Are we truly the authors of our actions, or are we sophisticated biological machines reading from a script written by our physiology? We like to believe in a conscious self that is in command, but neurobiology paints a picture of a self that is emergent, a fragile consensus reached by warring factions of neurons and hormones. The man who flies into a murderous rage because of a spilled drink is not merely a bad man, he is a man in the grips of a perfect storm, a catastrophic failure of internal governance. This is not to absolve him of responsibility, but to complicate it immensely. It suggests that our capacity for peace is as dependent on our biology as our capacity for violence. So, we are left standing at a crossroads between the animal and the angel, between the impulse and the act. We carry within us the biological formula for Shaqi, the chemistry of killing intent, a legacy etched into our very cells by millions of years of evolution. We have learned to suppress it, to mediate it with law and custom, to talk ourselves down from the ledge. But the potential is always there, humming just beneath the surface, waiting for the right combination of circumstance and chemistry to ignite. We medicate it, we therapize it, we try to civilize it away. Yet, the question persists, not as an accusation, but as a whisper from our own blood. If this urge is so deeply embedded in our biological operating system, are we ever truly in control, or are we merely perpetually holding our breath against the coming storm? And if this storm is not a flaw, but a feature, a brutal, effective tool that forged us in the first place, what does that say about the nature of our survival? Imagine a world where the line between a meal and a mortal threat is drawn by the edge of a flint knife, where the chill of a morning mist might conceal not just prey, but a rival. In an age where a single sharpened stone could decide the fate of an entire bloodline, what is your first instinct? To extend an open hand in a risky offer of peace, or to grip that stone tighter, your pulse quickening with the primal calculus of survival? This was not a world for the gentle. The meek did not inherit the earth. They were buried in it. Survival belonged not to the kind, but to the quick, the resolute, and, most crucially, the ruthless. Our ancestors did not walk through pristine, empty landscapes. They inhabited a world already crowded, not with cities, but with small, scattered bands of other humans, all tethered to the same life-giving resources: a watering hole, a flint outcrop, a migrating herd. Competition was the relentless background hum of existence. Skill in hunting a mammoth was a celebrated triumph, but it was only half the story. The other, darker half, was the ability to defend that hard-won prize from others who would take it, and the willingness to become that very threat to a neighboring group when starvation's shadow grew long. Life was a precarious balance between finding dinner and becoming it. This was a time when the club was as vital as the cradle, and the line between predator and prey was often blurred, shifting with the opportunity of a moment. The silent testimony of bones and broken artifacts tells a story far removed from any romanticized noble savage. Archaeological evidence, particularly from sites like the Atapuerca Mountains in Spain, paints a stark picture. The fossilized remains of our prehistoric relatives show a startlingly high incidence of traumatic injury. Fractured skulls, forearms raised in a defensive parry, these are the ghosts of ancient conflicts. Some studies suggest that, in certain periods, the rate of death by violent means within these early populations could reach a staggering 15 to 25%. This was not random chaos. It was a pattern. It was a brutal, effective filter. Those individuals, and more importantly, those cohesive groups that could organize, retaliate effectively, and preemptively neutralize threats had a measurable advantage. They protected their children, secured their resources, and in doing so, they lived to pass on their genes and their behaviors to the next generation. Their willingness to wield violence was not a moral failing. It was a Darwinian tool, meticulously sculpted by the unforgiving hands of natural selection. The very traits that made them formidable, aggression, suspicion of outsiders, a capacity for ruthless action, were the same traits that carved their lineage into the future. This ancient echo has not faded into silence. It resonates through the centuries, its frequency merely shifted into a new, more complex key. We no longer raid the next valley for its flint and berries, but the underlying imperative remains. The active defense mentality is the unspoken engine of modern geopolitics, where economic sanctions are the new spears and cyber attacks the invisible arrows. It fuels the cutthroat arena of corporate competition, where market share is a territory to be defended and a competitor's weakness is an opportunity to be exploited. We see its shadow even in the microaggressions of a family dispute, where the one who reacts with the most forceful emotion, righteous anger, a devastating verbal blow, often seizes the tactical high ground, setting a pattern that children unconsciously absorb and replicate. The individual who is quick to assert dominance, to push back against a slight, often gains a social advantage, perpetuating a cycle of confrontational behavior. The tools have evolved from clubs to contracts, from sharpened flint to sharpened words, but the deep-seated impulse to secure our own by any means necessary remains a powerful, often unchallenged, force within our psyche. So we are left standing at a crossroads, heirs to a brutal but effective legacy. If violence was once the indispensable key to our survival, the very chisel that carved us into who we are, what is it now? In a world of interconnected nations and looming existential threats, is this ingrained propensity for aggression a useless, even dangerous evolutionary hangover? A ghost in our neural machinery that now only serves to create instability and suffering? Or, in a strange and uncomfortable paradox, does it remain, in some vestigial way, a necessary component of our continued survival, the dark energy that drives ambition, defends borders, and fuels the resistance against tyranny. Have we truly outgrown the need for the club, or have we merely learned to carve its handle from finer materials, all the while keeping its weight familiar in our hands, waiting for the moment we feel we have no other choice? The evidence of this deep-time inheritance is not just statistical. It is sometimes chillingly personal. In a deep, dark cave system in northern Spain, a single skull rested for millennia, cradled in the mud. It belonged to an individual who lived 430,000 years ago, a member of an ancient human species. The skull was fractured, a clear and devastating puncture wound. Was this a tragic fall? An accident during a hunt? The meticulous forensic work of modern archaeology suggests something more sinister. The angle of impact, the force required. It points not to a stumble, but to a strike, a deliberate, targeted blow from another. This may be the earliest known case of murder in the human story, a single act of violence, frozen in time. But it raises a question that echoes far louder than the act itself. If this was murder, then who in the profound darkness of that cave was the killer? Deep in the cold, silent earth of northern Spain, at the very bottom of a vertical shaft, a story waited. It was not written on parchment or carved in stone, but fractured into bone, a dark secret held in the fractured dome of a skull. This is Cranium 17, one of more than 28 individuals lying together in the profound darkness of the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of the bones. For hundreds of thousands of years, the sediment settled around them, a gentle, final shroud over a gathering that has puzzled us ever since. Were they a solemn burial, a community laid to rest by grieving hands? Or were they something else, something that speaks to a far more ancient and shadowed part of our legacy? The first thing you notice is the stillness of the place. This is a cathedral of deep time, a natural cistern that became a tomb. The remains belong to Homo heidelbergensis, a people who walked the earth between our more ancient ancestors and the later forms we recognize more clearly, the Neanderthals and ourselves. They were strong, with robust bones and minds capable of crafting complex tools, of hunting massive prey, of surviving in a world of ice and giants. They were, in every sense, a successful species, and like any successful species, they must have had a complex social world, a web of alliances, affections, and, as Cranium 17 whispers, animosities. The skull itself is a relic of a single shattered moment. The damage is not the random chaos of a fall, the singular trauma of a rock fall from a cave ceiling. The forensic eye of modern science, applied across the chasm of 430,000 years, reveals a darker truth. Two fractures, nearly identical in size, shape, and orientation. They sit on the forehead, just above the left eye. The force required was tremendous, the object hard and unyielding. The angle of impact is consistent, not with a stumble, but with a blow, and then another, delivered in quick, brutal succession. This was not an accident. It was an execution. It is the earliest known evidence of one human killing another. The first murder. We can, if we dare, reconstruct the flicker of that moment. The raised arm, the grip tightening on a heavy tool, perhaps a wooden spear haft or a stone hand axe not meant for butchering animals. The face of the victim, a face that might have been known, recognized in the dim light. The swift, violent motion. The crack that echoes not just through the silent cave, but down the entire corridor of our history. The body, lifeless, then discarded, or perhaps carried and dropped into the deepest hole they knew. Was this an act of punishment? A crime of passion in a world we imagine to be solely about survival? A ruthless elimination of a rival? The evidence is stark, but it is also silent on motive. It offers the what with chilling clarity, but guards the why with absolute secrecy. This act, this primal scene of violence, feels unnervingly familiar. It is a blueprint that has been rewritten countless times, but never essentially changed. The targeted strike to the head, the precise and efficient application of force to the most vulnerable point, this is the grim knowledge of the predator who knows its own kind best. It is the same knowledge that lives in the alleyway, the battlefield, the crime scene photograph. It is a dark thread of continuity, connecting the Heidelbergensis in that Spanish cave to the present day. Has this potential for lethal interpersonal violence been woven into the very fabric of our being since the beginning? Is it a flaw in the design, or was it once a feature, a brutal necessity for navigating the complex hierarchies of our early societies? The pit of the bones offers no easy answers, only deeper questions. Cranium 17 is not alone down there. They are a community in death. Did they all meet a similar fate? Was this a single act of violence that stained their story? Or was this place a destination for those who transgressed some ancient, unwritten law? The killer was certainly one of their own, a person who looked like them, spoke like them, shared their fires and their fears. Was it a stranger from a rival group? Or was the violence intimate, a betrayal from within the circle of trust? The ultimate shock is not that violence existed, but that the calculus of murder, the deliberate, targeted ending of another's life, was already a known concept. They had a word for it or a thought for it, a dark space in their minds that we have inherited. So we are left at the precipice of that deep shaft, looking down at the bones and then back at ourselves. We have mapped our genomes, built civilizations, and created art that aches with beauty. Yet we have never quite escaped the shadow of that first fatal blow. The evidence from the pit suggests a creature capable of compassion and community. For why else would they carefully place their dead together? But Cranium 17 tells another story, one of a creature equally capable of cold, calculated termination. This is the paradox at our origin, the foundational crack not just in a skull, but in our own self-understanding. We are the species that cares, and the species that kills. If this is how our story with violence began, with a club swung in a dark cave, then what does that make us? And if the first murder is buried under 430,000 years of soil, how many more secrets lie hidden, waiting just beneath the surface of the ice? The wind howls across the spine of the Alps, a constant sculpting force that has shaped these peaks for millennia. It whips the fine, crystalline snow into shifting veils, obscuring and revealing the ancient rock beneath. On a high pass, where the air is thin and the world stretches out in a breathtaking panorama of stone and sky, a man stumbles. The sharp, cold scent of iron mixes with the clean, sterile smell of ice. His breath, once coming in ragged clouds, grows shallow. He falls. The crimson spill from his side is a shocking, violent flower against the gray canvas of stone, quickly dusted by the falling snow. The storm, indifferent to his story, begins its work of burial. His eyes close, not to open again for 5,000 years. The mountain keeps its secret, locked in a deep freeze. The world he left behind was one of slow, deliberate change. It was the Copper Age, a time of transition. Humanity was learning to coax metal from stone, to alloy copper with arsenic, forging tools that were harder, sharper, and deadlier than any that had come before. Communities were rooted in the land, their lives dictated by the seasons, the migration of game, and the wisdom passed down through generations. They were not primitive. They were pioneers of their age, with a complex understanding of their environment, of medicine, of social structure. This was Otzi's world. He was a man, not a relic. He walked these paths with purpose, his clothes expertly stitched from the hides of deer and goat, his body marked with the tattoos of a life lived, perhaps symbols of healing, perhaps of status. He carried a sophisticated toolkit, a copper axe with a U-handle, a flint dagger, a fire-starting kit, a quiver of arrows. Each object tells a story of resourcefulness, of a deep and intimate knowledge of the materials the earth provided. Then, on a September day in 1991, the long silence was broken. Two hikers, straying from the well-worn path, saw a shape in the meltwater of the Similon Glacier. They expected the debris of a more recent tragedy, a lost climber from a bygone decade. Instead, they gazed upon the leathery skin and serene, sunken features of a man from a time before pyramids, before Stonehenge, before written word. The discovery on the Austro-Italian border was a seismic event in archaeology. Here was not a skeleton, not a collection of artifacts in a grave, but a person, preserved with such startling intimacy that the contents of his last meal, ibex meat and grains, were still in his stomach. He was given a name, Otzi, and a new life as a window into a world unimaginably distant. The initial romance of the discovery soon gave way to a colder, more forensic truth. This was not a peaceful death from exposure. The X-rays and CT scans revealed a dark, telling shadow. Embedded deep in his left shoulder was a flint arrowhead. It had torn through his body, severing the subclavian artery. He would have bled out within minutes. The story grew more complex, more violent. There was a deep cut on his right hand, days old, evidence of a close-quarters fight. A blow to the head had likely rendered him unconscious just before the fatal shot. Then, the molecular evidence added more characters to this ancient drama. On his clothing and weapons, scientists found the blood of 4 other people. 1 was on the knife blade, 2 on the same arrow he had likely drawn from his quiver, and 1 on his goatskin coat. A narrative, dark and compelling, begins to coalesce from this evidence. We see a man caught in a desperate running battle. Perhaps he was a shepherd, a trader, or a chieftain. He was involved in a violent confrontation, defending himself, slashing with his knife, firing his arrows. He sustained a serious wound to his hand, but fought on. He was fleeing, climbing higher into the treacherous terrain he knew so well, perhaps believing the altitude would save him. He paused here, on this pass, exhausted. Maybe he felt a moment of safety, his guard down for a crucial instant. Then, the whistle of the arrow from behind. It came from a distance, an ambush shot. He was struck down by someone he never saw. The presence of other blood suggests he did not go down alone. He had fought, and he had killed. His death was not an accident. It was an execution. Otzi's story shatters any simplistic notion of prehistoric life as a peaceful, egalitarian idyll. His body is a frozen snapshot of a society already grappling with the complexities of conflict. This was not warfare as we know it. No organized armies, no nations clashing. This was something more intimate, and in some ways, more chilling. It was personal. It was a feud, a revenge killing, a territorial dispute, a struggle for resources or status. It speaks of alliances and enmities, of grievances that were worth pursuing across mountain passes and worth ending with a flint-tipped projectile to the back. It reveals a human heart already familiar with the cold calculus of murder. The technology had evolved from crude clubs to finely crafted arrows, but the impulse, it seems, was hauntingly modern. We can reconstruct the how with stunning accuracy, but the why remains entombed within him. Was he a revered elder ambushed by a rival group? A daring raider killed in retaliation for stealing livestock? Was the motive rooted in a challenge to his authority, a betrayal within his own community, or a simple act of robbery? We can weave 1,000 stories, but the truth is a ghost on the mountain wind. His meticulously crafted tools were left with him, arguing against theft. His copper axe, an item of immense value and prestige, remained by his side. This was not a random act of violence by strangers. It was targeted. It was personal. His silent, preserved form forces us to confront an uncomfortable continuity in the human experience. Here, in this vast, majestic landscape, at the very roof of the world, a man was hunted down and killed. The setting could not be more sublime, the act more brutal. It suggests that violence is not a product of modern corruption or crowded cities. It is a thread woven deeply into the fabric of our species, a potential that travels with us wherever we go. We carry our conflicts with us, from the fertile valleys to the highest peaks. Otzi's body is a time capsule, but its message is immediate. It tells us that the capacity for calculated, lethal treachery has been our companion for a very, very long time. If a single man on a remote mountaintop could be the target of such a precise and fatal act of vengeance, what then does that say about the nature of the groups we form? What happens when that same impulse is scaled up? When it engulfs not just one man, but dozens, entire communities, left in a silent, collective grave where the weapons are still tangled in the bones? Near the Nile, 13,000 years ago, a pit was dug. Not for a monument, not for a revered elder, but for the broken and the fallen. It was a grave, but it held no honor. It was a silent, desperate act of disposal, following a storm of violence we are only just beginning to comprehend. The sand, once warm under a relentless sun, cooled against their skin. The wind, which had carried their final cries, now began the long work of burying the memory under layers of time. Here, at a place we now call Jebel Sahaba, the first chapter of organized human violence was written not in ink, but in flint and bone. The site is a stark contradiction to the romantic image of our hunter-gatherer ancestors. We often picture small, nomadic bands moving like whispers across the landscape, living in delicate balance with nature and each other. Their world, we imagine, was one of survival against the elements, not against themselves. Jebel Sahaba shatters that illusion. It is one of humanity's oldest identified cemeteries, yet it is not a peaceful resting place. It is an archive of a single, cataclysmic event. The 61 individuals interred here were not laid to rest over generations. They were placed together, their bodies telling a story that the sands had tried to erase. They were a community, and they were massacred. The evidence is etched into their very skeletons, a brutal and unambiguous language. Nearly half of them, 40%, bear the marks of violent death from Stone Age weaponry. This is not the abstract casualty of a forgotten skirmish. This is intimate, personal violence. We see the fine, sharp point of a microlith, a tiny, lethal flint arrowhead still embedded in a ribcage, a moment of impact frozen for millennia. We see skulls fractured by the crushing blow of a club or a thrown stone. The angles of these wounds are particularly haunting. Many arrow wounds enter from the back, suggesting flight, a desperate attempt to escape an attacker they never saw coming. This was not a face-to-face battle between rival warriors. This was a hunt. Among the dead are women and children. Their bones speak the same language of terror. There is no evidence that they were spared, no suggestion that this violence adhered to any unspoken rules of engagement. A child's fragile skeleton, broken. A woman, felled by a projectile. This shifts the definition of what happened from a battle to something far more modern and far more chilling: a massacre. It was the deliberate, systematic killing of a group of people, regardless of their age, gender, or combat capability. The term feels anachronistic, a word we reserve for the horrors of My Lai or Srebrenica. We have long told ourselves that such brutality is a product of crowded cities, of complex societies, of modern ideologies and weaponry. We have located the origin of total war in the 20th century, or perhaps in the Bronze-Aged conquests of ancient empires. Jebel Sahaba pulls that origin back into the deep, deep past, into an era we thought was simpler, purer. This forces a profound and uncomfortable recalibration of our understanding of human nature. Was this an anomaly? A terrible one-off event, born of a unique and desperate conflict over a dwindling water source during a period of climatic upheaval? Or does Jebel Sahaba represent a darker thread woven into the very fabric of our species? The capacity for planned, coordinated violence against other, unarmed human beings may not be a learned cultural artifact of civilization. It may be a latent potential, a shadow that has always walked beside us. It is the dark flip side of our profound ability to cooperate, to form tight-knit groups. That very cohesion, which allowed us to thrive, also draws a boundary between us and them. And once that boundary is solidified in the human mind, does the them cease to be human? Does their otherness become a justification for their eradication? The bodies at Jebel Sahaba are a silent testament to a moment when that boundary became a killing field. They force us to ask if the club and the cradle were forged from the same human impulse. We look at these bones, these tools of flint that were used to feed and to kill, and we are left with a disquieting thought. This was not the end of something. It was perhaps a very early, very raw beginning. If this darkness was present at the dawn, then what does that say about the light we have built since? And if the silence of Jebel Sahaba was just the first whisper of this terrible human song, what echoes would we find if we listened to another shore, where the waters of an ancient lake once lapped against a scene of even more methodical execution? The stillness of the lake is the first thing you notice. 10,000 years ago, it was wider, fuller, a shimmering oasis in a landscape learning to be dry. It promised life, fish teeming in its shallows, waterfowl skimming its surface, lush vegetation along its banks. For a small band of hunter-gatherers, it was a cradle, a place to rest, to eat, to simply be. But on one day, at this place we now call Nadaruk, the cradle became a club. The water that gave life became a witness to a kind of death we like to believe came much later. They are not just bones. They are postures. They are sentences of agony frozen in the calculus of calcium and time. A man lies face down in the mud, his hands bound so tightly behind his back that the fibers of the rope, or perhaps a strip of sinew, left their permanent scorn on his wrist bones. He did not fall. He was placed there, discarded. A woman, just steps away, was found with the shattered mosaic of her skull, telling a story of immense, focused force. The blow was not haphazard. It was intended to end. Another has a stone projectile point embedded deep in his chest cavity, the violent geometry of the tip having pierced lung and life. One man's knees were smashed, the bones around them a catastrophic ruin. He was broken, then left. He would not run. This is the quiet horror of Nadaruk, a site in Kenya that serves as a stark open-air archive. 27 individuals, men, women, children, a pregnant woman, her fetus's tiny bones nestled within her own, both victims of the same crushing violence. There are no graves here, no careful arrangements for an afterlife, no tokens of respect or mourning. These bodies were left where they fell, in the shallow water and the lakeshore mud, to be preserved by the very element that had sustained them. They did not defend themselves. The weapons used were not from this place. The story, written in fractures in stone, is unmistakable. They were ambushed. A group of people, perhaps another band of nomads, came from elsewhere. They came with purpose. We look at these bones, and we see the obvious, a massacre. But the deeper we look, the more familiar the patterns become, and the more the chasm of 10 millennia seems to collapse. This was not merely killing. It was a strategic, brutal operation. The bound hands speak of capture and control. The shattered knees are not just wounds. They are messages, a brutal form of immobilization. The presence of a pregnant woman among the dead, but the conspicuous absence of young women of reproductive age, whispers a darker truth. They were not killed. They were taken. The resources of this lush lakeshore were not the only prizes. The people themselves were a form of property to be seized. In this, Nadaruk holds up a mirror to our modern soul, and the reflection is chillingly ancient. We see the same calculus in the ethnic cleansings of the Balkans, the genocidal horrors of Rwanda, the raids of militias throughout history. It is a formula of conflict that transcends time. Identify a resource, be it land, water, or people, dehumanize the ones who possess it, and use overwhelming, terrorizing violence to seize it. The goal is not just to win, but to obliterate and acquire, to break knees so no one can follow, to take women to assimilate them, to leave the dead unburied as a warning. The tools change from stone points to bullets, but the blueprint, it seems, was drafted long ago in the mud of a prehistoric lakeshore. This discovery forces a profound and uncomfortable reevaluation of a comforting narrative. We have long told ourselves that war, organized group-on-group violence, is a product of our own invention, a malignant flower that bloomed only after we settled down, after we fenced off plots of land, planted seeds, and called them mine. Agriculture, we thought, created surplus, which created wealth, which created jealousy, which created the need to defend and to conquer. War in this story is a bastard child of civilization. But the people of Nataruk were not farmers. They were foragers, nomads living in a world we romanticize as one of primal innocence. They had no permanent houses to defend, no granaries to plunder. Yet, they were annihilated with a efficiency that feels anything but innocent. So where does this leave our understanding of ourselves? If the seeds of such calculated violence were already deeply sown in the human psyche 10,000 years ago, does that make it an intrinsic part of our condition? Is the capacity for coordinated intergroup annihilation woven into the very fabric of our social being, a dark thread waiting for the right conditions to be pulled to the surface? Or was Nataruk a tragic anomaly, a perfect storm of drought, scarcity, and desperation that erupted into a single, horrific event, leaving behind not a rule, but a rare and grisly exception? The bones offer no easy verdict. They simply present the evidence of what happened on that day by the lake. They testify to the fact that the line between a community and a war party can be terrifyingly thin. The evidence lies before us, not as a conclusion, but as a deeply unsettling question. If this darkness already existed before we ever built a wall or owned a field, then what truly did we invent? And if killing for territory and resource is this ancient, what does it mean when we find evidence of those who went a step further, who crossed a final, unthinkable threshold? What happens when the violence is not just about taking a life, but about consuming it? Consuming. The cave is cold, silent, a cathedral of stone holding its breath for millennia. Deep within its shadows, buried in the ochre-stained earth, lie bones. But these are not the scattered remains of a bear or a deer, arranged by the indifferent paws of a predator or the slow, patient work of time. These bones tell a different story. They are human, or nearly so. They belong to a Neanderthal, and they are shattered, cut, and carved with a terrible, familiar precision. The long bones are fractured in a spiral, not by a fall, but by a deliberate, calculated blow. The skull bears the fine, sharp scars of a flint tool scraping away the last vestiges of flesh. This is not a burial. It is a butchery. The act of killing is one dark thread in the human story. But to kill and then to consume, that is a deeper, darker shade altogether. In the quiet laboratories where these relics are measured and scanned, the air grows thick with unspoken questions. The caves of Vindija in Croatia, El Cedron in Spain, and most notably Krapina, have become libraries of a macabre text written in bone. At Krapina, the fragments of nearly a dozen Neanderthal individuals were found commingled, a jigsaw puzzle of the departed. The markings on them are not random. They are systematic. They follow the exact same patterns found on the bones of animals recovered from the same sites. The deep cuts at the attachments of large muscles, the percussion fractures to access the rich fatty marrow within the core of the limbs. It is a recipe, a guide to disassembly. The evidence is stark, undeniable. Someone, or someones, processed these bodies with the same pragmatic efficiency they would apply to a fallow deer or an auroch. The tools of survival were turned upon their own kind. The immediate visceral conclusion is one of desperation. Cannibalism, born of starvation. A harsh winter, a failed hunt, the gnawing void of hunger that erases all other taboos. In the brutal calculus of survival, a dead clansman is no longer a person, but potential calories, a means for the group to live another week. This is a narrative we can almost understand, a dark impulse we can reluctantly acknowledge from the safety of our full stomachs. It paints the Neanderthals as ultimate pragmatists, victims of a world that offered no mercy. Yet, the story may not be so simple. The cuts are too careful, the process too methodical. This does not have the frenzied look of starvation, but the practiced hand of ritual. Could it be that this was not about hunger at all, but about something far more complex?
To answer that, we must look beyond the cave and across the vast expanse of human culture. We find that the consumption of human flesh is rarely just about sustenance. For the four people of Papua New Guinea, it was an act of love and respect, a way to incorporate the spirit and virtues of a deceased relative into the living. In certain ancient Mesoamerican cultures, ritual cannibalism was the ultimate religious act,
a way to commune with the divine and absorb the sacred power of a captured warrior. The body was not mere meat, it was a vessel of meaning. What if the Neanderthals of Krapina were engaged in a practice equally profound? What if the breaking of the bone was not just to get at the marrow, but to release the spirit within? The careful processing could then be seen as a form of reverence, a final intimate rite to honor the dead and ensure their essence continued on within the community. The same physical act, a cut mark on a femur, holds two diametrically opposed meanings, one of base survival, the other of spiritual transcendence. This is the central haunting paradox. The ultimate violence, the destruction and consumption of one's own kind, may not always be the endpoint of brutality. It might also be the foundation of a belief system, a sacred act that binds a community together in a shared, terrifying mystery. It forces us to abandon our comfortable distinctions. We want to see our ancient cousins as either noble savages or brutish animals, but they, like us, likely lived in a world where the lines between the profane and the profound were blurred, where a tool for skinning a kill could also be an instrument of ceremony. The evidence in the cave does not give us a verdict. It presents us with a mirror, reflecting our own complex capacity for creating meaning around our most primal acts. We are left to wonder if the darkest thing one can do is to eat another person out of hunger, or to do so out of love. If this was their way, a practice woven from both necessity and belief, where does that leave the story of us? We, Homo sapiens, who would eventually walk into their world and inherit the earth, we who call ourselves modern. Did we bring a new kind of peace, or simply a different flavor of violence? The sand of the northern Nile Valley holds its secrets close. For millennia, it cradled the remains of a community, a silent testament to a moment frozen in time. Then, the archaeologists' brushes swept away the dust, grain by grain, to reveal a story written not in ink, but in bone. At a site known as Jebel Sahaba, a 14,000-year-old cemetery yielded the skeletons of Homo sapiens, beings anatomically identical to you and me. But this was no peaceful resting place. The skulls were shattered, fractured by impact. Stone points, the very technology we hail as a hallmark of our ingenuity, were found embedded deep within vertebrae and pelvises, lodged where soft tissue once was. These were not deaths by misadventure. They were deliberate, violent, and final. The first modern humans, it seems, were met with a very ancient end. This grim discovery at Jebel Sahaba pulls the rug from under our feet. We often imagine our earliest direct ancestors as stepping onto the world stage as enlightened beings, finally separated from the brutish existence of their hominin cousins. We call ourselves the wise man, a title that carries the weight of expectation, implying a fundamental break from a violent past. But the bones tell a different story. Here, in this prehistoric graveyard, there were no Neanderthals, no heavy-browed Homo heidelbergensis, only people who, if dressed in modern clothes, would walk through a crowd unnoticed. Their tools were refined, their culture presumably complex, capable of ritual and burial. Yet they were also capable of coordinated killing. The evidence suggests not a lone murder but a massacre, perhaps a brutal skirmish between groups. The bodies were buried together, a communal tragedy sealed in a collective grave. Where we might hope to find the dawn of modernity, we find instead the shadow of an old, familiar specter. This revelation forces a difficult comparison. We look back at the fractured skull of a Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave, known as Cranium 17, and we see a story of interpersonal violence from over 40,000 years ago. We study the remains of Utsi the Iceman, a man from 5,300 years ago,
with an arrowhead buried in his shoulder and evidence of a close-range blow to the head. We examine the site of Nataruk in Kenya, where 10,000-year-old skeletons, including those of a pregnant woman and children, show signs of brutal, fatal injuries. The thread of violence is not a frayed rope we finally cut. It is a continuous strand woven through the very fabric of our genus. The arrival of Homo sapiens did not mark the end of this thread. The difference, then, may not be the presence of conflict itself, but the scale it could achieve. With greater cognitive power came the ability to organize, to hold grudges across time, to see the other not just as a rival for resources, but as an abstract concept to be eliminated. The club became a spear, the spear became an arrow, and the act of violence could be enacted from a distance, both physical and emotional. So what truly separates the first Homo sapiens from their formidable ancestors? Anatomically, the differences are clear. A higher forehead, a less robust skeleton, a brain case organized in a subtly different way. This neurology granted us an unparalleled fluency in symbolic thought and language. We could weave narratives, share complex ideas across generations, and build communities bound by more than just kinship. This is the cradle of our art, our science, our compassion. Yet this very same tool seems to be a double-edged sword. Did this new capacity for abstract thought also give us a sharper, more terrifying ability to dehumanize? Could we now not only cooperate to build a village, but also to raid one? The sophisticated tools found at Jebel Sahaba were not just for hunting. They were turned with equal efficiency upon our own kind. The cradle, it appears, could also be a weapon. This leaves us with a profound and unsettling paradox. We are a species of breathtaking creativity and deep empathy, capable of producing the Sistine Chapel and symphonies. Yet, we are also the architects of trenches and concentration camps. This duality was not invented with the sword or the gun. Its blueprint is etched into the bones at Jebel Sahaba. The first of our kind possessed the same heart, the same mind, the same potential for both creation and destruction that we carry today. They were us, in every meaningful way. Their world was one of immense challenge and scarcity, where conflict might have been a stark necessity for survival, a brutal arithmetic of resources. But does context excuse the action or merely explain it? Does the shadow of necessity lessen the darkness of the deed? We comfort ourselves with the narrative of progress, believing that each century pulls us further from that primordial brutality. We speak of becoming more civilized, as if civilization is a suit of armor that can finally deflect our oldest instincts. But if the first modern humans, equipped with the same fundamental cognitive software that powers our societies today, were already capable of such acts, what does that say about the software itself? Perhaps civilization is not a state we achieve, but a conversation we constantly have with ourselves. It is the daily, conscious choice to build the cradle and not raise the club. The men, women, and children buried at Jebel Sahaba are a stark reminder that this choice has always been and will always be before us. Their silence screams a question across the millennia. If the capacity for organized violence is woven into the same fabric as our genius, can we ever truly be free of it, or must we simply, perpetually, choose to be? And if these bones can tell such a vivid story of a single conflict, what deeper history of war remains buried beneath our feet, waiting for a trowel to uncover its forgotten scale? When there is no written word, who tells the tales of the first battles? The answer lies in the silent, patient earth, in the bones that carry the faint, enduring whisper of the past. These are not just remains. They are archives written in calcium and trauma, waiting for the right hand to brush away the soil and the right mind to listen to their stories. They speak of a time before chronicles, before epics, a time when history was not recorded in ink, but etched directly into the human frame, a brutal and honest ledger of our earliest conflicts. This is the domain of conflict archaeology, a discipline that reads the material ghosts of prehistoric strife. It deciphers the cryptic language of a fractured skull, the final posture of a body felled by a spear, the strategic placement of a simple palisade. It listens to the stories told by a flint arrowhead still embedded in a ribcage, a silent testament to a moment of impact that echoed across millennia. These are the crime scenes of deep time, where the victims are long past pleading, but the evidence remains, stubborn and eloquent. The soil does not judge, it merely preserves. It holds the broken tools and the broken bodies with equal impartiality, offering them up as puzzles for us to solve. What drove one human to shatter the skull of another? Was it a sudden, savage skirmish over a watering hole, or something more calculated, more profound? Consider the Tollens Valley in northern Germany, a place of quiet water and green fields that belies its violent secret. Here, around 1250 BCE, the Bronze Age erupted into a cacophony of chaos. The riverbed became a mass grave, preserving the remains of nearly 140 individuals, a number that hints at a conflict far beyond a tribal feud. These were men in their prime, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of professional violence, parry fractures on arms raised in defense, devastating wounds from bronze-tipped arrows and wooden clubs. This was not a raid. This was a battle. The scale of Tollens forces us to rewrite our assumptions, to see the prehistoric world not as a series of isolated primitive scuffles, but as a stage for organized, large-scale warfare. Who were these men? What banner, what chief, what desperate cause drew them to this riverbank to die in such numbers? The valley offers no easy answers, only the stark, skeletal evidence of a coordinated horror. And the story is written in bone across the globe. High in the Andes, archaeologists unearth skulls from 1,000 years ago that tell a quieter but no less violent tale. Many are cratered with healed fractures, a record of ritualized combat that was a recurring, almost accepted part of life. But others are shattered, their stories ended by a final, overwhelming blow. In bogs and in deserts, on coastlines and in caves, the same narrative repeats itself. A femur snapped by a heavy weapon, a pelvis pierced by a projectile point, a mass grave where bodies were tossed without ceremony, a communal end to a personal struggle. Each skeleton is a frozen moment of terror and pain, a single frame in the long, scrolling film of human aggression. They are all individuals who loved, feared, and hoped, yet their collective fate speaks to a universal and unsettling human potential. We look at our modern world with its terrifyingly efficient machinery of war, stealth bombers, intercontinental missiles, weapons that can erase cities from a continent away, and we feel a sense of immense distance from the club-wielding warriors of Tollens. We see technology and assume evolution, but the bones urge us to look deeper. The tools of conflict have transformed beyond recognition, from polished stone to hypersonic steel. But has the engine of conflict itself truly changed? The fractured skull from the Andes and the satellite image of a contested border tell fundamentally the same story, a struggle for territory, for resources, for the power to dictate terms. The logic is eerily consistent. The club sought to control the hunting ground. The missile seeks to control the region. The desire to possess, to dominate, to eliminate a threat, these are ancient, hardwired impulses merely dressed in new armor. Are we looking at a history of technological progress, or are we simply seeing the same old animal wearing a series of increasingly sophisticated masks? This archaeology of blood does not provide a grand, unified theory of war. It cannot tell us if violence is an innate curse or a cultural invention, but it does something more powerful. It provides undeniable, intimate testimony. We do not need ancient scrolls to tell us that our history is written in conflict. We only need to look at the healed fracture on a brow ridge, the arthritic joints of a warrior who survived his battles only to be felled by time, the tiny skeleton of a child caught in the crossfire of an ancient raid. These are not abstractions. They are the proof. They bear witness to a long, unbroken chain of aggression that stretches from the deepest past into our present moment. It is a chain whose links are forged from the same base materials: fear, ambition, and the desperate will to survive. So,
we are left with the bones and their silent, screaming question. They show us that the struggle is ancient, perhaps as old as humanity itself. But in showing us the unchanging nature of the wound, do they also condemn us to an endless repetition of it? Or is there, hidden within the same genetic code that carries the impulse for violence, a fainter, more fragile blueprint for something else? The evidence is all there, buried in the ground. We have only just begun to read it, and as we brush the dirt from a blade or a bone, we are faced with a reflection not just of who we were, but of who we are. If the first large-scale battles began when we learned to forge metal into weapons, what primordial shift occurred when we first learned to domesticate a seed? When the abundance of the hunter-forager gave way to the anxious harvest of the farmer, did we simply exchange one struggle for another? Before we learned to cultivate the earth, we walked through it. We were creatures of the forest, of the plain, of the riverbank. Food was not a possession to be hoarded, but a transient gift to be gathered. A berry from a bush, a fish from a stream, water from a spring that belonged to no one and everyone. The world was a shared larder, vast and seemingly endless. There was no concept of mine, only ours in the moment of consumption. Then, one day, a profound and terrible shift occurred. Someone, somewhere, drove a stake into the soil, looked at another human and declared, "This is mine." With that simple act, the world shrank, and blood began to water the ground. This was not a sudden event, but a slow, inexorable turning, a revolution measured in generations. Roughly 10,000 years ago, our ancestors stepped across an invisible threshold into the Neolithic Age, the agricultural revolution. This was humanity's great wager with nature. Instead of following the food, we decided to chain it to the earth. We domesticated wheat, barley, and lentils. We corralled goats, sheep, and cattle. In doing so, we unknowingly domesticated ourselves. We traded the nomadic uncertainty of the hunter-gatherer for the sedentary anxiety of the farmer. The bounty was unprecedented: surpluses of grain, stores of meat, reserves for lean times. But this bounty came with a price, a hidden clause in our contract with the land. For the first time, we had something tangible, immovable, and immensely valuable to lose. We had land. We had harvests. We had property. And where there is property, there must be protection. Where there is surplus, there is the seed of conflict. The archaeological record from the cradles of civilization, the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia, the Nile Delta, the plains of Anatolia, whispers this truth not in grand declarations, but in silent, stone testimony. The earliest villages were open, their homes clustered in organic harmony. But as granaries grew deeper, so did the need for walls. We see the emergence of fortified settlements, of villages encircled by ditches and palisades, then by stone ramparts. The tools of harvest began to share their design with the tools of war. A flint sickle, sharpened and hafted differently, becomes a lethal blade. The copper once used to adorn the body was soon hammered into the first daggers and axes, objects of terrible beauty whose sole purpose was to tear through flesh and bone. Conflict was no longer a fleeting skirmish over a hunting ground or a perceived insult. It became a calculated dispute over territory, over stored wealth, over the very source of life itself. The stakes were now permanent. This shift echoes through the millennia, a deep and persistent rhythm in the symphony of human society. From the guarded stockade of a Neolithic farming community to the razor-wire fences and satellite-monitored borders of a modern nation-state, the fundamental question remains unchanged. The actors and the stage sets have evolved with breathtaking complexity, but the core drama is the same. Who has the right to claim ownership, and who grants the authority to use violence to defend that claim? We built legal systems, deeds, and titles to codify possession, yet at their heart, they are a more sophisticated version of that first stake in the ground. We created standing armies and police forces, institutionalizing the right to violence, sanitizing it with uniforms and laws. But does this institutionalization change the essential nature of the act? Or does it merely obscure it behind a veil of bureaucracy? We tell ourselves we fight for gods, for kings, for ideologies, for freedom. Yet, so often, if one scrapes away the layers of rhetoric, one finds the same ancient, hard truth beneath: the struggle for control of resources, for the land that grows the food, the water that sustains it, the energy that powers our modern world. It is a seductive, logical trap to conclude that when resources become scarce, war is an inevitable, biological imperative, a brutal arithmetic of survival. And indeed, history offers ample evidence to support this grim equation. But is this the only law that governs us? Are we forever bound to this bloody logic, destined only to refine the methods of our possession and the efficiency of our violence? Or, hidden within our capacity for territoriality and aggression, is a parallel capacity for something else, for complex cooperation, for shared sacrifice, for the creation of rules that benefit the group over the individual? The walls we built to keep others out also enclosed us, forcing us to find a way to live together within them. The very surplus that sparked conflict also made specialization possible, giving rise to the artisan, the priest, the storyteller, roles that transcend the basic calculus of acquisition. Perhaps the story is not one of simple inevitability, but of a constant, tense negotiation between these two opposing forces within us: the instinct to take and hold, and the instinct to build and share. We mastered the earth, but did we forge a cage for our own spirits in the process? And if this is the game we invented, can we ever choose to stop playing? Or have the rules now written themselves into our very bones? Yet within these new walled worlds, another hierarchy began to crystallize, another layer of complexity laid upon the foundation of ownership. If the defense of land and grain became paramount, then who would be its primary defenders? And in becoming its defenders, what power would they then claim for themselves? The artifacts show us an increasing glorification of the warrior, the entombment of men with their weapons, a societal value placed on strength and martial prowess. Was the role of man as fighter predetermined by this new, desperate need to protect what was ours, solidifying a division that would ripple through millennia of human culture? In the deep twilight of a primordial forest, or under the vast, star-strewn sky of the savannah, a question hangs in the air, as old as the first human group that ever gathered around a fire. Who holds the weapon? Not just who carves it from wood or sharpens it from stone, but who is expected and permitted to wield it? Who is the one who kills, and who, more tellingly, is celebrated and rewarded for the act? This is not a question of mere survival, but of something far more complex, something that would come to shape the very architecture of human society. It hints at the silent, brutal genesis of status, where violence and social standing became inextricably and perhaps irrevocably linked. From the very beginning, the organization of the group and the stratification of power seem to have walked hand in hand with the division of labor. In the cradle of community, there also lay the club. As bands of hunter-gatherers navigated a world of scarcity and threat, the ability to inflict violence became a currency. It was a grim calculus. The capacity to protect the group from predators and rival bands, to secure resources through force, translated directly into influence. The one who could fight, who could project power outward, was often the one who garnered respect inward. This was not a formal election, but a slow, organic accretion of prestige, where a reputation for ferocity became a magnet for loyalty. The group, in its collective subconscious, began to trade safety for submission, creating the first, faint outlines of a hierarchy built on strength. Anthropological whispers from the edges of the modern world offer a stark window into this past. Consider the Yanomami of the Amazon rainforest, where the status of a man is profoundly tied to his prowess as a waiteri, a fierce being. Here, raids and revenge killings are not mere bursts of chaos. They are structured, cultural performances. A successful warrior does not slink back to his village in shame. He is met with ritual cleansing, feasts, and the elevated regard of his people. His violence is a service, and his reward is social capital. Similarly,
Among the Dani people of New Guinea, complex rituals of warfare were once central to their existence. A warrior's kill was a public event, a cause for celebration that solidified his place within the social fabric. Even among the Inuit, often romanticized for their peaceful adaptability, the role of the skilled hunter and protector carried an implicit authority, a quiet dominance respected by all. In these societies, the title of warrior was never just a role one played. It was an identity, a station, a platform from which one's voice would carry further. It was the first rung on a ladder that led upward. The echoes of this ancient bargain resonate through the steel and glass canyons of our modern world. The equation of masculinity with the capacity for controlled violence has not vanished. It has simply been sublimated, dressed in new costumes. The action hero on the screen, a near mythological figure, solves problems with his fists and his wit. His physical dominance a direct proxy for his moral rightness. In the controlled chaos of contact sports, the boxing ring, the football field, the hockey rink, we create sacred spaces where violence is not just permitted, but glorified, and its masters are rewarded with fame, wealth, and adulation. The military uniform remains one of the most potent symbols of authority and honor in any society, its prestige a direct descendant of the warrior's status. The boardroom battle, the cutthroat negotiation, the relentless drive to dominate a market, these are often described in the language of combat. We have polished the club, but its fundamental weight and purpose remain. The underlying imperative seems unchanged: to compete, to dominate, to climb. One must still, in some essential way, be prepared to fight. This leaves us standing before a profound and unsettling crossroads. If the very bedrock of our social hierarchies, the deep-seated wiring of our respect, is so fundamentally intertwined with the capacity for violence, what does that say about our potential for a truly different future? Can we ever fully dismantle a structure whose foundations were laid with the first stone axe wielded for prestige? Is it possible to construct a ladder of status that isn't, on some level, carved from the same old wood of dominance and aggression? Or is this impulse to rank ourselves based on the power to harm an indelible part of our inheritance, a ghost in the machine of civilization that we can only hope to tame, but never truly exercise? And if this drive for status through dominance is so deeply encoded, what happens when it is triggered not by a need for resources, but by something far more volatile, something invisible and intangible? What kind of violence emerges when the only thing wounded is a concept, a story a group tells about itself, when the only thing to be gained is not land or food, but the fleeting, burning satisfaction of honor restored? The man was not killed for his land or his livestock or the coins in his pocket. He was killed for a word, a single misplaced phrase, an inflection of voice that carried the wrong shade of respect, a joke that landed not as humor, but as a profound and public insult. The weapon that felled him was not the blade itself, but the invisible, unbearable weight of a wounded honor. And so, the blade fell, and with it, a chain was set in motion, a grim and ancient algorithm of action and reaction. His kin, bound by a duty thicker than blood, are now compelled to answer, and when they do, the kin of the first killer will, in turn, raise their own weapons. The score must be settled, the ledger of respect must be balanced, and the only currency accepted is blood. This is not a plot from a grim tragedy. It is a pattern, a social code so deeply embedded in the human story that it has emerged independently in deserts, in mountains, in dense rainforests, and on remote islands. Among the Bedouin tribes tracing paths across the endless sands, a man's worth is his word and his courage. An affront to one is an affront to all, and the response is not a matter of choice, but of existential necessity. To let an insult stand is to become the insult itself, to be marked as weak, to invite further predation. For the Pashtun of the rugged borderlands, the concept of Pashtunwali provides the sacred script for this drama. Badal, the obligation of revenge, is a core pillar. It is the engine of justice in a world without an overarching police force,
a system that ensures a price is always paid. Far away, among the Maori warriors of Aotearoa, Utu represents a similar principle, a reciprocal force that maintains the cosmic and social balance. It is not merely vengeance, it is a restoration of equilibrium, a resetting of the scales of mana or spiritual power. In the deep green shadows of the Amazon, a shouted accusation, a dispute over a marriage, can ignite a feud that smolders for generations. Passed down like a dreaded heirloom from grandfather to father to son, the killing is never just an attack, it is always a response. It is a language where the final punctuation is always a period of blood. What is this powerful, perilous idea that can so effortlessly override the instinct for self-preservation? It is the notion that the self is not contained within a single body. The individual is a node in a network of relations. His honor is the family's honor. His shame is the tribe's shame. An insult is not a personal slight to be brushed off. It is a crack in the foundation of the entire group's social standing. In such a world, forgiveness is not a virtue. It is a dangerous liability. It is read not as mercy, but as capitulation, an advertisement of vulnerability. There is no room for abstract justice, for third-party adjudication. The law is personal, immediate, and tactile. The responsibility for enforcement falls directly upon the wronged party. This creates a world of terrifying clarity and profound fragility. Every interaction is charged with potential consequence. A glance held for a second too long, a failure to offer the expected hospitality, a marriage proposal rejected too harshly. Any of these could be the spark. The story of interclan hatred is not a myth. It is a recurring chapter in the human chronicle, written in the indelible ink of shared identity and perceived disgrace. It asks an uncomfortable question. Is a cohesive, fiercely loyal community possible without the dark specter of sanctioned violence standing guard at its borders? One might assume that such primal patterns would fade under the glare of modernity, dissolved by the acids of urbanization, formal legal systems, and global connectivity. But the grammar of honor and revenge proves remarkably adaptable. It simply learns new dialects. In the concrete canyons of a modern city, street gangs operate on a code that would be instantly recognizable to a tribal elder. A sign of disrespect, a stolen glance at the wrong person, a territorial incursion. These are the modern equivalents of the misplaced word. Retaliation is mandatory. It is the glue that holds the group together, that proves loyalty and maintains a terrifying form of street credibility. To fail to retaliate is to lose face, to lose standing, to become nothing. In other parts of the world, so-called honor killings present a brutal perversion of this ancient logic, where the perceived dishonor of a female family member, a choice in love, a manner of dress, is believed to be cleansed only through her death. A chilling testament to the idea that the group's reputation is more valuable than an individual's life. Even in the schoolyard, the seeds are sown. The bully and the bullied, the cycle of taunts and retaliatory punches, the social exclusion that feels like a death sentence. These are micro-feuds, rehearsals in a smaller theater for the same primal play. The stage sets change, the weapons evolve, but the underlying script of perceived slight and demanded response remains hauntingly familiar. Has the context truly evolved, or have we just swapped the clan's grazing lands for a neighborhood turf, the chieftain's hall for a corporate boardroom where reputations are assassinated with a carefully worded email instead of a spear? This compulsion suggests that honor is not a sturdy shield, but something infinitely more fragile, a perfect, transparent sphere that must be constantly guarded, for the slightest crack will shatter it completely, and for millennia, the only glue believed to be strong enough to mend it was blood. It was the ultimate seal of seriousness, the irrevocable proof that one's dignity was non-negotiable. This system, for all its brutality, provided a perverse sort of order. It set rules for chaos. It demanded that every action have an equal and opposite reaction, creating a predictable, if horrifying, rhythm to human conflict. It was a law that everyone understood. So, As we look out at our world of satellites and smartphones, we are forced to wonder, have we truly evolved beyond this primal calculus, or have we simply refined our tools? Have we traded the stone knife for the sharpened word, the public ambush for the anonymous online smear campaign, the blood feud for the endless culture war where we seek not to understand, but to utterly destroy the honor of those who think differently? If the core impulse remains, the quickness to take offense, the urge to retaliate, the need to publicly demonstrate the strength of our tribe, then what precisely has changed besides the efficiency of our weapons? Is our modern aversion to such violence a sign of moral progress, or merely a comfortable privilege afforded by a strong police force and a reliable grocery store? The chain of retaliation waits, patient and eternal, for the moment the thin veneer of civilization wears through. And if this is the chaotic, personal origin of conflict, what happens when this raw impulse is captured, tamed, and organized? When the hot blood of revenge is cooled into the cold calculus of strategy? In the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians did more than just invent writing and harness the river's flow. They forged a new kind of power, one that moved in unison. They created the army. Rows of men, sheathed in leather and copper, advanced not as a chaotic swarm, but as a single, terrible entity. They turned and struck not from individual rage, but at the sound of a horn or the beat of a drum. This was no longer mere violence. It was violence orchestrated. It was the birth of a dreadful symphony where the instruments were spears and shields, and the music was the calculated art of war. This shift from spontaneous brutality to managed conflict marks one of humanity's most profound and unsettling evolutionary leaps. It did not begin with a declaration, but with an organization. The earliest human conflicts were likely skirmishes, ambushes and raids driven by immediate need or hot-blooded impulse. But as societies grew, planting roots in the earth and building walls around their granaries, their conflicts grew with them. The raid evolved into the campaign. The war party became a professional army, complete with generals who thought in terms of strategy, not just strength. This was the moment violence was put on a payroll, given a uniform, and taught to march. It was the moment we began to manage our most destructive instinct, not to suppress it, but to perfect it. Across the ancient world, from the Nile to the Tigris and Euphrates, the evidence of this new professionalism is etched into clay and stone. The Egyptians depicted their pharaohs, not as brawlers, but as master strategists in chariots, overseeing battles from a distance. The Hittites, with their 3-man ironclad chariots, were an early form of mobile armored division, capable of shattering infantry lines. The Assyrians, perhaps history's first true military empire, left behind detailed reliefs showing their engineers building siege ramps and battering rams, their soldiers forming testudo-like shields walls. And in the ruins of Sumerian cities we find the standardized weapons, the same type of helmet repeated over and over, the first evidence of mass production for mass-organized killing. Victory was no longer a question of who was fiercer in the melee, but of who had planned for the scarcity of water, the fatigue of the march, the angle of the sun. The winner was the one who could think 10 moves ahead on a bloody chessboard whose squares were fields of mud and blood. The logic that governed these ancient armies is a ghost that still haunts our modern world. The drill instructor on a parade ground, barking orders to instill muscle memory and unit cohesion, is performing a ritual that would be familiar to a Roman centurion. The general in a situation room, moving icons on a digital map, is engaging in the same abstract calculus of force and terrain as Alexander the Great at Gaugamela. The technology has transformed from the bronze-tipped spear to the stealth drone, but the underlying grammar of conflict remains eerily constant. It is still a cold equation of power, a game of resources and logistics, of deception and morale. We have simply found faster, more efficient ways to solve the same brutal problem. The club became a sword, the sword became a gun, the gun became a missile. But the hand that holds it is guided by a mind wrestling with the same ancient strategic dilemmas. This professionalization of violence forces a difficult, almost paradoxical question. By organizing killing, by giving it structure, ranks, and pensions, Did we somehow make it more acceptable? More civilized? There is a terrifying efficiency in this system. A spontaneous act of violence is a crime. A premeditated one, carried out by a soldier in uniform, is an act of war. One is condemned, the other is often celebrated with monuments and medals. In putting a uniform on violence, did we merely dress a wolf in sheep's clothing, granting a moral license to slaughter so long as it was done by the book and under the right flag? The organization of war created a distance, not just physical, the archer firing from 100 yards away, but psychological. It allowed the individual to submerge their moral agency into the will of the unit, the order of the commander, the need of the state. The act of killing was sanitized, broken down into a series of procedures and commands. And so we are left to ponder this intricate machinery we built, this system that channels our darkest potential into disciplined, strategic action. We mastered violence by giving it a manual, but in doing so, did we inadvertently legitimize it? If killing is just a job, a profession with its own skills and honors, then what does that say about the nature of the work itself? The structure makes it manageable, but does that management make it any less monstrous? Or does it simply make the monster more effective? The question lingers, heavy and unresolved, as we watch the geometric patterns of troops advancing across an ancient bas-relief, a sight both awe-inspiring and horrifying. For if organized violence can be justified by strategy and statecraft, then what happens when it seeks a justification far greater, an authority far higher? What happens when the general's strategy is whispered to him not by a scout but by a god? When the army doesn't just march for a king but for heaven itself? The fire does not discriminate. It consumes the oxygen in the air, the dry wood of the pyre, and the flesh of the man bound to the stake with the same indifferent hunger. His crime was not theft, nor murder. His crime was a thought, spoken aloud into a world unprepared for its weight. God does not exist. The men who light the flames do not do so with rage contorting their faces. Theirs is a look of solemn duty, a serene and terrifying certainty. They look not at the dying man but through him, to a higher audience. They are not murderers. They are instruments, conduits for a divine will they believe is using their hands to cleanse the world of a dangerous error. They kill not out of hatred, but out of a love for what they perceive as sacred order. This is the profound and chilling paradox at the heart of faith, the capacity for ultimate love and ultimate violence, born from the same source. This duality is as old as our first attempts to comprehend the terrifying mystery of existence. In the dim, flickering light of the Neolithic world, as communities gathered around fires, they began to sense patterns in the chaos, the life-giving sun, the destructive storm, the spirit of the hunted animal. The first gods were born from this need to explain, to appease, to find agency in an unpredictable universe. These early deities were not solely benevolent guardians. They were powerful, capricious forces that demanded propitiation. And so, from the very cradle of belief, alongside prayers for fertility and abundance, emerged the practice of sacrifice. The offering, whether harvest, animal, or in its most extreme form, human life, was a transaction, a desperate bargain with cosmic powers. Violence was sanctified, transformed from a brutal act of survival into a sacred ritual, a necessary bloodletting to ensure the continued turning of the world. History's ledger is stained with the ink of this sanctified violence, written in a script that repeats itself across continents and centuries. The Aztec priests atop the Teocalli pyramids did not see themselves as brutal killers. As they raised the obsidian blade, they were performing the most vital duty imaginable, feeding the sun god Huitzilopochtli with the still-beating human heart, without which the cosmos would plunge into eternal darkness. The victim was not merely a prisoner of war, they were a vessel, a crucial offering to sustain creation itself. Across the ocean, centuries later, the knights of the Crusades fastened crosses onto their tunics. They marched toward Jerusalem not as invaders, but as liberators, their swords blessed, their violence absolved by papal decree. To die in the effort was to secure a place in heaven, to kill was to do God's work.
The ensuing slaughter was not a tragic byproduct of war, but, in their eyes, a holy act of purification. This machinery of justified persecution reached a chilling efficiency in the dungeons and public squares of Reformation Europe. The Inquisition did not simply execute heretics. It first meticulously extracted confessions, creating a framework where violence was not just permitted, but legally and theologically mandated. The burning of a heretic was a public service, a grim theater meant to illustrate the terrible cost of doctrinal deviation and to reaffirm the unity of the faithful. It was a violence of cold logic, of bureaucracy applied to belief, where the screams of the victim were drowned out by the solemn chanting of priests. In more recent times, in public squares, the cry of Allahu Akbar has been perverted to precede acts of beheading, a brutal declaration that this violence is for God's glory, a punishment for blasphemy or apostasy. In every instance, religion did not invent the human capacity for cruelty, but it provided a uniquely potent justification, a framework that could transmute base aggression into righteous duty, transforming the perpetrator from a common killer into a holy warrior, a defender of the faith. The modern world, for all its secular trappings, has not escaped this dynamic. It has merely found new arenas and new lexicons. Open warfare still erupts under the banner of defending a faith against infidels or heretics. But more subtly, the digital town square now hosts its own form of sanctified violence. Words become weapons, hurled with the self-assured fury of the zealot. Character assassination, dogpile shaming, and vicious diatribes are launched from behind the shield of moral superiority. The vocabulary has shifted from outright theological condemnation to terms like problematic, unethical, or heretical to the new secular creed. But the underlying architecture remains eerily familiar, an unshakable conviction in one's own righteousness, the dehumanization of the other, and the fervent belief that causing harm is not just acceptable, but obligatory to protect a sacred ideal, be it a deity, a social doctrine, or a political truth. This leaves us hovering over a deep and unsettling abyss of a question. If the very systems we create to seek transcendence, to connect with the divine, and to codify morality are so vulnerable to being weaponized, what does that say about the nature of belief itself? Is this violent potential an external corruption, a parasite that latches onto pure faith? Or is it something more intrinsic, a dormant seed within the heart of absolute conviction waiting for the right conditions to sprout? When a belief system claims a monopoly on truth, does it inevitably create its own shadow? The heretic, the infidel, the unbeliever, who must be eliminated for the system's own purity? Can a faith built on promises of exclusive salvation ever truly coexist with others without the threat of violence simmering beneath the surface? The flame that consumes the blasphemer and the candle that guides the seeker are made of the same element, yet they serve diametrically opposed purposes. Perhaps the true test of a belief is not the intensity of the devotion it inspires, but its resilience against the human urge to wield it as a club. Can a faith cultivate a humility that allows for doubt, for the unknown, for the sacredness of the other, and thus inoculate itself against the poison of absolutism? Or is the marriage between the divine and the sword an inevitable part of our story, a dark thread forever woven into the tapestry of human aspiration? The ashes of the burned settle cold on the ground, but the question they form hangs hot in the air. If this is the cost of a single life deemed offensive to the divine, what then is the price of an entire world? The dust settles not with a whimper, but with the silence that follows a great and terrible storm. It is a quiet that is not peaceful, but empty, a void where the laughter of children, the arguments of lovers, and the songs of elders once resided. To trace the arc of human history is to trace a map written in shades of crimson, a chronicle of ascent built upon the leveled ruins of others. The story of empire is not merely one of grand aqueducts, codified laws, and sprawling roads that stitch continents together. It is also, and perhaps more fundamentally, the story of extinction. The price of ultimate power, it seems, is etched not in stone, but in the vanishing of entire peoples, their languages fading to echoes,
their gods forgotten, their very existence reduced to a footnote in the victor's grand narrative. Imagine the horizon, not as a line between earth and sky, but as a trembling, dust-choked smear. From it emerges not an army, but a force of nature given human form. Genghis Khan rides, and where he passes, the world turns to ash. Cities are not just conquered, they are unmade, their stones scattered, their populations rendered into statistics of unimaginable loss. A number that whispers of 11% of the world's breath snuffed out. This is not an anomaly. It is a pattern, a recurring brutal rhythm in the song of our species. Civilizations do not always crumble from within, from decadence or natural disaster. More often, they are hewn down by the sword of a stranger, their end delivered from the outside by those who see their walls not as monuments to achievement, but as obstacles to ambition. This is the dark backdrop against which the spotlight of history shines. The rise of an empire always casts a long and murderous shadow. What is often recorded as civilizing or pacifying is, from another angle, simply the mechanics of domination, the seizure of land, the systematic suppression of culture, the relentless grinding down of resistance until it ceases to be. It is the language of power, and its grammar is violence. The word progress itself can become a hollow euphemism, a shiny veneer glued over the raw, splintered wood of conquest. To make the world orderly in one's own image first requires the chaotic, violent erasure of the images that were already there. We know this. Our libraries and archives are filled with the evidence, though we often choose to read them as tales of glory rather than manuals of obliteration. The Romans did not simply defeat Carthage. They sought to scour it from the earth, sowing the fields with salt, so that nothing might grow again. A symbolic act of such finality, it echoes through millennia as the ultimate metaphor for erasure. The Assyrian Empire, with chilling efficiency, perfected the art of terror, not just defeating rebellious city-states, but systematically dismantling them, deporting populations, melting down identities in the crucible of their imperial machine. The death toll was not a byproduct of these conflicts. It was the strategy. It was the calculus of power. Maximum terror for maximum compliance. The complete annihilation of the other to ensure the absolute security of the self. And we console ourselves by thinking this is ancient history, a relic of a crueler, less enlightened age. We look at the ruins of Carthage and the steppes conquered by the Mongols as artifacts, safely contained behind the glass of time. But is the pattern truly broken, or has it merely evolved, putting on a modern suit and speaking with a more sophisticated vocabulary? The world wars, with their industrialized slaughter and camps designed with bureaucratic efficiency for extermination, were not aberrations. They were the ancient logic of empire scaled up with 20th century technology. The colonial project, which carved up continents and presented itself as a bearer of light, was often a relentless engine of subjugation, resource extraction, and cultural genocide, dismissing ancient ways of life as primitive to justify their eradication. The chilling term ethnic cleansing is itself a modern invention, a sterile clinical phrase that tries to sanitize the old, bloody practice of killing until a problem disappears. The tools change, the musket replaces the broadsword, the policy document replaces the royal decree. But the underlying impulse remains hauntingly familiar. To kill in order to establish a new order, to create a homogeneous whole, by violently removing the unwanted parts. So we are left standing in the quiet aftermath, looking out over the landscapes of our present, which are built upon ancient graves. Every nation, every culture that exists today, stands to some degree on ground that was once fought for, won, and lost by others. The very earth beneath our feet is a palimpsest of sovereignty, written and rewritten in blood. This forces upon us a deeply unsettling and perhaps unanswerable question. If the greatest power humanity can achieve has always been inextricably linked to the spilling of blood on a monumental scale, can any civilization truly be called prosperous if its foundation is a burial ground? Can a society ever be considered morally advanced if its wealth, its stability, its very existence is the dividend paid out from an account of historical atrocity? We enjoy the fruits of order, of law, of infrastructure. But are we, in some quiet way, always dining in a hall built atop a crypt? This contemplation leads us to a threshold, to a violence that is even more perplexing and terrifying because it lacks the cold, calculated logic of empire. For what happens when the bloodshed is not for land, not for resources, not for power, not for a new order, but for nothing at all? What dark corner of the human soul is exposed when the mob gathers not for war, not for revenge, but simply for the primal, intoxicating feeling of the swing, the feeling of the blade connecting? A crowd gathers. The air, thick with the heat of too many bodies and a low, buzzing anticipation, hums with a strange energy. In the center, a figure is bound. The reason is unimportant, lost to the moment. A shout rings out, sharp and clear, a single spark in dry tinder. It is not a word of reason, but a sound of pure impulse. Then the first blow falls, then another, and another. A rain of violence, not from a single cloud of anger, but from a collective storm. No one knows the victim. No one asks. And in the swirling mass, no one stops. The act itself, the raw physical sensation of the strike, becomes the entire point. It is not for war. It is not for revenge. It is simply for the feeling of being allowed to strike. This spectacle, this descent into collective madness, is not an anomaly in human history, but a recurring, haunting refrain. It echoes from the stone circles of antiquity to the digital town squares of today. We often cloak our darkest impulses in the garb of necessity, war for survival, justice for retribution. But what we witness in the spontaneous brutality of a mob is something far more primal and unsettling. It is violence stripped bare of any grand narrative, reduced to its essence, a release, a ritual, a terrifyingly simple satisfaction found in the shared permission to break a taboo. This is the violence that needs no reason, the madness of the crowd where individual conscience drowns in the ocean of the collective. To understand this, we must step away from the modern courtroom and into the ancient plaza. Anthropologists and historians trace the threads of what they term festive violence through the tapestry of human cultures. The Maya practiced a form of ritualized ball game where the losing captain, far from being scorned, was sometimes sacrificed, a profound honor that fed the cosmological order with his blood. In ancient China, public executions were grand, theatrical events, morality plays where the dismemberment of a criminal served as both entertainment and a grim reinforcement of social hierarchy. In medieval Europe, festivals often featured the symbolic beating or mocking of a scapegoat figure, a collective catharsis that purified the community by expelling its symbolic sins. In these instances, bloodshed was not a byproduct of conflict, but the central purpose of the gathering. It was a social glue, bizarre and brutal to our eyes, that bound the community together through a shared, sanctioned transgression. The violence was the point. It was the ritual itself. The mechanism that allows a single, ordinarily peaceful individual to become a cog in a brutal machine is what social psychologists call de-individuation. It is the psychological process of losing one's sense of self-awareness and personal identity within a group. The individual self, with its unique moral compass, its memories, its inhibitions, dissolves. In its place emerges a collective identity, a single-minded entity driven by a simplified, often amplified, emotion. The anonymity of the crowd provides a cloak. Responsibility is diffused across 100 faces, 1,000 hands. I did not throw that stone. We did. The action is no longer owned by an individual but by the mob itself, a force that seems to have a life and a will of its own, separate from the people who constitute it. The rational mind, so vigilant in solitude, goes quiet. It is not overpowered by rage, but simply switched off, replaced by a more ancient, tribal programming. We like to believe such phenomena are relics of a less enlightened past, confined to the pages of history books describing barbaric spectacles. But the crowd has simply found new forms, new arenas in which to play out its ancient scripts. A riot that erupts after a sporting event where the joy of victory or the anguish of defeat mutates into the mindless destruction of property and assaults on strangers follows the same primal logic. The modern witch hunt, however, has migrated to the digital realm. We see it in the frenzied online mob that forms in minutes, descending upon an individual who has been deemed to have transgressed some unwritten social code. The details are irrelevant. The identity of the target is secondary. The crowd coalesces, not with rocks and clubs, but with keystrokes and shares. The violence is verbal, emotional, but the psychological architecture is identical. The anonymity of the avatar, the diffusion of responsibility among thousands of commenters, the loss of individual empathy in the fervor of collective judgment. The laughter that accompanies a public shaming, the gleeful piling on, it is the digital equivalent of the shout that started the stoning. It is the same sensation, the same feeling of permission to unleash cruelty without a personal reason, now amplified to a global scale. The medium has changed, but the human heart beating beneath it has not. This forces upon us a deeply uncomfortable question about the nature of our own humanity. If a normally rational, moral person can so easily shed their individuality and commit acts they would never contemplate alone, what does that say about where our true self resides? Is our civilized behavior, our empathy and restraint, merely a thin veneer, a performance we maintain only when we feel ourselves to be watched as individuals? And does the anonymity of the crowd simply peel that veneer back, revealing a more fundamental, baser layer of our social being? We are a species capable of profound love, breathtaking art, and soaring intellectual achievement. Yet we are also capable of becoming a single, mindless organism whose only function is to destroy. The individual is the cradle of conscience, but the crowd can become its coffin. So where does this leave us? If our reason can so easily be switched off by the mere presence of others, what truly controls our actions? The individual self we hold so dear, or the contagious fever of the group? And if this fever is a part of us, a latent potential in every community, then where, precisely, does it live? Is it written in our culture, learned through social mimicry? Or could it be etched somewhere deeper, in the very biology of our brains, a ghost in the neural machine waiting for the right conditions to emerge? We have looked at the crowd, but perhaps we must now look inward, into the darkness of the skull itself. If we were to map the terrain of the human mind, to chart its constellations of neurons and chemicals, where would we even begin to look for the source of such primal collective fury? What if the capacity for the mob is not just around us, but within us, a silent architecture waiting for its moment? He was a quiet man, a good neighbor, known for his gentle demeanor and the meticulous care he took with his rose bushes. To those who knew him, the idea that he could raise a hand in anger was unthinkable. Then, one evening, a storm broke inside his home. A sudden, inexplicable rage overtook him, a fury so absolute it left his wife and children severely injured. The man himself was bewildered, a prisoner watching his own body commit atrocities. The trigger, when it was finally discovered, was not a hidden malice or a secret life, but something far more tangible and far more unsettling. A routine MRI scan revealed the culprit. A small, benign tumor, no larger than a grape, was pressing insistently against a specific region of his brain, the prefrontal cortex. With its delicate architecture compromised, the very seat of his impulse control and moral reasoning had been silenced. The courtroom, a place designed to adjudicate guilt and innocence, was suddenly faced with a new confounding variable. Was this man a criminal or a patient? This case, far from unique in the annals of neurology, forces a profound and uncomfortable question. If something as physically discrete as a tumor can dismantle the pillars of a personality, then where precisely does violent behavior reside? We imagine evil as a shadow in the soul, a conscious choice made in the dark. But the scalpel and the scanner reveal no such homunculus of hatred. The brain is not a uniform mass of tissue where good and evil do battle. It is a vast, intricate network of specialized regions, a symphony of electrical impulses and chemical whispers. Within this complex landscape, decades of research have begun to map the coordinates where the embers of aggression are fanned into flame. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons deep within the temporal lobe, acts as our sentinel for threat. It is the engine of our most primal fears and angers, the trigger for the fight-or-flight response that once ensured our survival on the savannah. Then there is the prefrontal cortex, the evolved, sophisticated CEO of the brain, sitting just behind our forehead. It is the seat of executive function, judgment, foresight, empathy, and most crucially, inhibition. It is the calm hand that restrains the amygdala's urgent, often irrational alarm bell. And connecting these two, the hypothalamus serves as a command center, translating emotional signals into physical action, a raised fist, a shouted curse, a surge of adrenaline. The balance between these regions is everything. Damage to the prefrontal cortex, whether from a tumor, a traumatic injury, or a developmental abnormality, doesn't create anger. It simply removes the brakes. Studies of individuals with such injuries reveal a common thread: a loss of impulse control, a flatness of affect, and a startling capacity for cold, dispassionate violence devoid of remorse. They know the rules of society, but the emotional weight of those rules has been severed. Conversely, an overactive amygdala, perhaps due to chronic stress, trauma, or genetic predisposition, can flood the system with signals of threat, causing a person to perceive danger where none exists, to react with disproportionate fury to a minor slight. Neuroimaging studies of convicted violent offenders, particularly those with histories of impulsive aggression, consistently show these patterns: an underactive prefrontal cortex failing to regulate a hyper-reactive amygdala. The neural pathways of calm deliberation are dim, while the highways of raw, reactive emotion are lit up like a furious city at night. This scientific mapping leads us to a startling crossroads in our understanding of justice and morality. Our entire legal and ethical framework is built upon the concept of free will, the idea that an individual consciously chooses their actions and is therefore responsible for them. But what happens when the very instrument of choice is broken? If a tumor can hijack the machinery of the self, then where does the self end and the biology begin? We already accept this principle in other arenas. We treat a diabetic for a lack of insulin. We do not blame them for a failing pancreas. We medicate for Parkinson's tremors or epileptic seizures, understanding them as neurological events, not moral failings. So why is the line so fiercely defended when the malfunction manifests as violence? Our interventions for aggression, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness meditation, psychiatric medications, are all, at their core, attempts to rewire or re-regulate the nervous system. They are exercises in neural negotiation, teaching the prefrontal cortex to speak more firmly to the amygdala, to soothe the primal fear. But this medicalized view creates a deep philosophical rift. If a brain is structurally miswired from birth or damaged by circumstance beyond its control, does the concept of moral blame even hold meaning? Or does it become a cruel abstraction, like blaming a computer for a hardware glitch? We are left standing before the defendant and before ourselves with a dilemma that refuses easy resolution. To absolve all violence as a mere biological glitch is to dismantle the foundations of society and invalidate the suffering of victims. Yet, to ignore the stark evidence of the brain scan is to cling to a supernatural view of evil that science is steadily eroding. The man with the tumor had his removed. The rage subsided. Was he healed or simply repaired? Did we fix his soul or just his circuitry? The law struggled with this, ultimately settling on a verdict that acknowledged the biological cause but still demanded accountability. It was a messy compromise, reflecting our own confused transition from a world of spirits to a world of synapses. We can no longer comfortably locate the capacity for violence solely in the abstract realm of the heart or the soul. It is encoded in the fissured landscape of our cortex, whispered, in the chemical languages of serotonin and dopamine, and shaped by the physical integrity of our neural pathways. This is not a reduction of humanity to mere machinery, but rather an expansion of our understanding of the profound and sometimes terrifying intimacy between our biology and our being. If the capacity for evil does not come from a heart blackened by sin, but from a few cubic centimeters of tissue gone awry, then who ultimately do we hold responsible? The person, or the precarious architecture they inherited? This realization doesn't end the inquiry. It merely deepens it, pushing us from the hardware of the brain to the software that is written upon it from our very first breath. For if not everyone is born with a predisposition for violence, why do some minds become so adept at wielding it? If the brain's map can be drawn by genetics, can it not also be etched, line by painful line, by experience itself? No one is born with a fist clenched, ready to strike. That is a lesson the world teaches. A hand opens to grasp a finger, to hold a toy, to explore the texture of bark on a tree. But when that same hand is met with a slap, when the world answers its curiosity with violence, the lesson changes. The fist learns to form. It is a quiet, terrible education. We are not born for brutality, but we can be raised by it. Consider a single story, one of millions. A boy grows in the shadow of his father's rage. His childhood is not measured in birthdays, but in the intervals between beatings. The air in the house is thick with the promise of pain, a constant low-frequency hum of dread. He learns the subtle shift in his father's breathing that signals a storm is coming. He learns to make himself small, to be silent, to become invisible. This is his first survival skill, retreat. He carries this silence with him into the world, a deep, still lake of watchfulness. For years he is the quiet man, the one who never raises his voice. Then, one afternoon, a mundane argument over a dented fender in a parking lot, a shouted insult. And from the depths of that still lake, a monster he did not create, but that was forged in that childhood home, erupts. The fist, after a lifetime of training, finally strikes. A man lies dead. The quiet man is gone, replaced by the echo of his father's rage. Where does the violence truly begin? In that moment of impact, or in the 1,000 moments of impact that came before? This is not merely a tragedy of character. It is, perhaps, a tragedy of programming. Evolutionary psychology suggests that our early environment doesn't just shape our opinions, it scripts our fundamental responses to the world. It writes the code for our fight or flight instincts, and for some, the flight option is systematically erased. In an environment of persistent threat, where a caregiver is also a predator, a child's brain must adapt to survive. Hypervigilance becomes a default setting. The nervous system, constantly bathed in stress hormones like cortisol, learns that danger is not an exception, but the rule. The world is not a cradle to be rocked in. It is a club that could swing at any moment. In such a world, is it not a rational adaptation to learn to swing first? To interpret a neutral glance as a challenge? A raised voice as a prelude to an attack? The brain, in its desperate wisdom, chooses a strategy of preemptive aggression. It is a flawed and tragic shield, but a shield nonetheless. This aligns with a broader concept known as the fast life strategy. In unstable, high-risk environments where the future is a precarious notion, the brain and body accelerate. Why invest in long-term planning if you may not see tomorrow? Why develop deep empathy if those around you are sources of pain? The strategy is to live fast, react instantly, and seize immediate rewards or defenses. It is a life lived in the stark present tense. Impulsivity, a lack of hesitation, and a certain emotional distance are not moral failings in this context. They are highly adaptive traits. They are the psychological calluses formed to protect a raw and wounded spirit. The child learns to read the micro-expressions of anger on a face with the precision of a scholar, yet becomes illiterate in the language of gentle affection. Is this a choice, or is it the only language he was ever taught?
The evidence of this cruel curriculum is etched into the demographics of our prisons. The biographies of violent offenders are, with a haunting regularity, variations on a single grim theme. A childhood punctuated by abandonment, neglect, physical abuse, and witnessing domestic violence. It is a near universal prologue. The violent man was very often first a violated boy. His rage is not an original creation. It is a legacy, an heirloom of pain passed down through generations. He does not invent his brutality, he inherits it. He replicates the only model of power and control he has ever known. The fist that strikes another is often mimicking the arc of a fist it once learned to fear. So, when we condemn the act of violence, are we also condemning the student for mastering the only lesson he was ever so thoroughly taught? This leads us to a tentative observation, a single slice of a much deeper truth. Violence is rarely a sudden eruption. It is more often a slow, steady drip of learned behavior, a tap left running in a damaged heart until it overflows. It is a language of last resort for those who were never given the words for peace. If this is so, if the emotional wounds of childhood are indeed the fertile soil where the seeds of violence take root, then our entire perspective on justice and prevention must shift. Punishment becomes a futile response to a symptom, while the disease, the cycle of trauma, continues to spread unseen. The real intervention cannot begin in a courtroom. It must begin in a living room. It must begin with protecting the quiet child, with teaching a different, gentler language before the first lesson of the fist is ever given. It is about healing the wound before it can infect a lifetime. But if healing is the antidote, how do we administer it to a past that cannot be changed? And if our earliest experiences carve such deep channels for our behavior, can we ever truly redirect the river of our own nature? Or are we forever echoing the battles of our childhood, simply choosing different arenas? The lone individual hesitates. Their hand might tremble, their conscience might whisper a frantic, urgent no. But place that same individual within a group, a crowd, a movement, and the unthinkable becomes not just possible, but probable. The internal moral compass, so carefully calibrated by a lifetime of experience, spins wildly, its needle now pointing only toward the collective will. Alone, we are a single, fragile thread of doubt and deliberation. Together, we become a rope, strong enough to pull down monuments or hang a man. Why is it that our humanity, our capacity for reason and compassion, seems to evaporate in the steam of a crowd? The story begins in the sterile, fluorescent-lit basement of Stanford University's psychology department in the summer of 1971. It was designed to be just an experiment, a 2-week simulation. A group of ordinary, healthy, psychologically screened young men were divided by the mere flip of a coin into 2 roles, prisoners and guards. There were no scripts, no instructions on how to be cruel. The researchers, led by Philip Zimbardo, simply wanted to see what would happen when people stepped into the costumes of power and powerlessness. The transformation was not gradual. It was a violent landslide. Within days, the young men playing guards had morphed. They devised cruel and humiliating punishments. They forced prisoners to do push-ups, stripped them naked, denied them food, and locked them in a dark, claustrophobic closet they called the hole. They did not see their charges as fellow students, as friends, or even as human. They saw them as numbers, as problems to be broken. The simulation was terminated after only 6 days. The line between reality and role had not just blurred, it had been utterly erased. What does it take for a person to forget themselves so completely? Is the uniform we wear more powerful than the soul it contains? This phenomenon has a name in the cold, precise language of social psychology: de-individuation. It is the psychological state of losing one's sense of individual self-awareness and personal accountability within a group. It is a fading away, a dissolution of the I into the we. In this submerged state, the normal constraints that govern our behavior, guilt, shame, the fear of consequence, are loosened, washed away by the powerful current of anonymity.
The crowd becomes a cloak, hiding the individual not just from the eyes of others, but from their own internal judge. Actions are no longer one's own. They are the actions of the mob, the team, the nation. The responsibility is diffused, spread so thin across 1,000 shoulders that it weighs on none. This is the alchemy of the crowd. It transmutes the solid gold of individual conscience into the base, cheap alloy of collective impulse. If my voice is lost in the roar, does my scream of protest even matter? Or is it simply another note in the terrifying symphony of the many? The work of Zimbardo, and before him Stanley Milgram with his chilling studies on obedience to authority, paints a portrait of human nature that is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the propensity for cruelty is not a monstrous aberration found only in a few, but a dormant potential within us all, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. We do not need to be evil to commit evil acts. We only need a convincing narrative, a sanctioned role, or the reassuring presence of others doing the same. We need to be able to point to a commanding officer, a political leader, a holy text, or simply the person next to us and say, "They told me to. They are doing it too. Therefore, it must be acceptable." This is the great moral vanishing act, where personal agency disappears in a puff of social justification. Is obedience, then, the bedrock of society or its most dangerous flaw? When we surrender our judgment, to whom or what do we ultimately surrender our humanity? We need not look to decades-old experiments to see this force at work. It is the engine of our modern world, playing out on digital screens and city streets. Online, de-individuation finds its perfect habitat. Shielded by pseudonymous avatars and vast physical distances, people become capable of a venomous cruelty they would never exhibit face-to-face. A comment section becomes a Roman Colosseum, a viral tweet, a call to arms. Cyberbullying drives children to despair because the perpetrators are not a single, identifiable tormentor, but a faceless, hydra-headed swarm. Everyone was saying it becomes the ultimate empty defense. In schoolyards, a child is ostracized or abused not by a lone bully, but by a pack whose members feel braver and less culpable within its confines. Even the stark power dynamics of police brutality often involve a group mentality, where the actions of one officer are tacitly sanctioned or escalated by the presence of others. The mechanism is always the same. The individual recedes, and the crowd takes the wheel. In the digital age, have we simply found a new, infinitely scalable arena for our oldest tribal instincts? So we are left with a haunting, paradoxical question. If our innate sense of right and wrong can be so easily switched off, like a light in an empty room, by the simple fact of being in a group, what does that say about the nature of our morality? Are we, at our core, ethical creatures, compassionate, reasoning beings who built civilizations on cooperation and empathy? Or is that morality merely a thin veneer, a delicate mask we wear for social approval, a performance that cracks and falls away the moment the audience changes from a judgmental society to an approving mob? Is our conscience the true essence of our being, or just a convenient tool, easily set aside when a more powerful identity beckons? Perhaps the real truth lies not in choosing one over the other, but in acknowledging that we contain both capacities. The same human heart that can ache for a stranger's suffering can also beat in unison with a chanted slogan of hate. The individual is both the solitary thinker and the communal actor. And if the crowd has the power to erase our morality, then what human invention, what grand structure have we built in a desperate attempt to cage that very power? We created rules to protect us from the chaos of our own nature. But did we build a cradle for our conscience, or simply a more sophisticated club? If the law is our answer to the mob's madness, then what is the true nature of that answer? Was it born from our highest ideals? A collective agreement to restrain our inner beasts, to protect the weak from the strong, to replace the wild justice of the crowd with the measured scales of reason? Or is it, in its own way, merely another form of the same violence, now sanitized, legitimized, and placed in the hands of the state? Does the law stand as a shield against our darkness, or is it simply the ultimate expression of the crowd's will, now dressed in robes and given a gavel? Does it prevent death, or does it merely license it? The man stole a goat. The elder pronounced the judgment. Cut off his hand. The village nodded in agreement. In that moment, a quiet, collective violence was born, not of passion, but of order. Who, then, is the more terrifying figure? The desperate thief, acting from hunger or greed? Or the calm, impersonal system that metes out mutilation in the name of peace? This is the ancient, unsettling paradox at the cradle of law. We tell ourselves that laws were created to curb our darkest impulses, to build a wall between civilization and the savage. But what if that wall was never meant to keep violence out? What if it was designed to let it in, through the front gate, dressed in the robes of authority? As human societies grew from scattered tribes into dense, intricate civilizations, the simple, immediate justice of the clan was no longer enough. The web of human interaction became too complex, the potential for conflict too vast. Law emerged from this chaos as a necessary scaffold, a set of rules to manage the terrifying freedom of humanity. It was a monumental achievement, a promise of order over anarchy. Yet, from its very inception, this tool for controlling violence carried within it a deep and troubling irony. It did not seek to eliminate force. It sought to monopolize it. The law became the ultimate arbiter, not by rejecting violence, but by claiming the exclusive right to wield it. The club was taken from the hands of the individual and placed into the hands of the state, polished, sanctified, and given a new name: punishment. One of the earliest and most vivid testaments to this duality is the Code of Hammurabi, etched into a finger of black diorite nearly 4,000 years ago. It speaks in the language of absolute order, its 282 laws a sprawling attempt to regulate everything from commercial disputes to marital strife, and at its heart lies the brutal, elegant principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. On its surface, this seems a law of limitation, a decree that the punishment must fit the crime, preventing the bloody escalations of a feud. It is a mathematical equation of pain. But look closer. By codifying this exchange, by writing it in stone and declaring it the will of the gods, the law did not just limit violence, it authorized it. It gave a priest or a king the divine right to pluck out an eye, to shatter a tooth. The violence did not disappear. It was simply centralized, becoming a sanctioned performance administered by the powerful. This pattern echoes through the dusty scrolls and stone tablets of antiquity. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh, a god-king, was the source of all law, and his decrees could condemn a man to be beaten with rods, to have his nose cut off, or to be sent to labor in the brutal quarries. A slow, legalized death sentence. In the warring states of ancient China, legalist philosophers like Han Feizi argued for a system of harsh, impersonal punishments to maintain absolute control, creating a machinery of state terror where the law was a blade held at the throat of the populace. The Romans, master administrators, perfected the legal spectacle of death. Crucifixion along the Appian Way was not merely an execution, it was a stark advertisement of the price of defying Rome's order, a grim mile marker of legalized power. In each case, the law provided the stage, the script, and the mask for violence to be performed not as a crime, but as a civic duty. This legacy is not a relic confined to history books. It pulses through the veins of our modern world, though we often choose not to see it. The death penalty, still active in numerous nations, is the most direct descendant of this ancient tradition. The debate around it is almost exclusively about its application. Is it applied fairly? Is it humane? But rarely about its fundamental nature, the state's assertion of the right to kill its own citizens as a final, irrevocable judgment. We argue over the method, the morality, the statistics, while quietly accepting the underlying premise that this ultimate violence can be legitimate if the process is followed. Similarly, The power vested in police and military forces to use lethal force is a grant of legal violence. A police officer draws a weapon in a split-second decision. A soldier follows rules of engagement. These actions, when deemed justified, are not recorded as murders but as exercises of authority. The violence is the same. A life is ended, but its legal classification transforms it from a savage act into a sanctioned one. The system absorbs the blow and legitimizes it. This forces upon us a deeply uncomfortable question. Does the law exist primarily to protect people or to protect power? It claims to do the former, and often it does, shielding the weak from the strong, the individual from the mob. But its mechanisms, its prisons, its sanctions, its ultimate punishments are also the primary tools for maintaining the status quo. A law can be used to protect a citizen's right to protest, or it can be used to declare that protest illegal and disperse it with batons and tear gas. The same legal system that convicts a murderer can also be used to evict a struggling family onto the street, an act of slow, bureaucratic violence. The law is not a monolithic guardian of good. It is a territory, a language, and it is fought over by those who seek protection and those who seek control. Its greatest trick is making its own violence seem invisible, normal, and necessary, while branding all other violence as criminal. So we are left standing before a structure that is both shield and sword. We are asked to trust it, to live within its walls, to believe in its fairness. And we must, for the alternative is a chaos none of us would choose. But perhaps the price of that trust is eternal vigilance. If the law is the sharpest tool we have ever forged to restrain our darkness, must we also remain acutely aware that it is a blade that can be turned against us? We built it to cage the beast, only to discover that the beast now wears a judge's robes and speaks in the measured tones of precedent. Can we ever truly know if the hand that holds the scales is balancing them, or merely weighing the cost of our compliance? And if this legalized violence can be so clean, so clinical, so buried in paperwork and procedure, what are we to make of the opposite impulse, the ancient theatrical urge to make violence not just legal, but spectacular? What happens when the goal is not merely to kill, but to be seen killing? When a head is mounted on a city gate or an execution is scheduled for the town square, the message is no longer confined to the victim. It is a performance for the living, a dark ritual written in blood and fear. Why does power, once it has claimed the right to violence, so often feel the need to put it on display? The condemned man is bound to a wooden frame in the public square. The air is thick with the smell of dust and sweat, and a low, eager hum rises from the crowd. The executioner, a man whose profession is both feared and revered, steps forward. His tool is not an axe for a quick end, but a small, sharp knife. This is the Ming dynasty, and the sentence is lingqi, the death by 1,000 cuts. The first slice is met with a collective, sharp intake of breath, which soon morphs into something else. Not screams of horror, but cheers of grim approval. The executioner works with a practiced, almost artistic precision. He is not merely ending a life, he is performing a craft. The blood that soaks the earth is not just a biological substance, it is a pigment, a paint used to draw a message for all to see. Is this killing, or is it theater? The line, it seems, was drawn not to be crossed, but to be spectacularly violated. This ancient spectacle reveals a profound and unsettling truth about human societies. Violence is rarely just an act. It is a language. A single murder in a dark alley is a crime. A public execution is a statement. It is a form of brutal communication, a message carved not in stone, but in flesh, intended not just for the victim, but for the entire community. It serves to intimidate, to warn, to demonstrate unequivocally who holds the power to punish, to define justice, and to impose order. The violence itself is secondary to the symbolism it carries. The severed head on a spike is not merely a head, it is a period at the end of a sentence written by the powerful. It whispers a chilling promise to every onlooker. This could be you. The body becomes a text, and its mutilation is a grammar of terror, a way for authority to inscribe its will directly onto the public consciousness. This grammar of power through symbolic violence is a universal chapter in the story of civilization. In medieval Europe, the corpses of traitors were publicly dissected, their body parts parboiled and displayed on the gates of major cities to rot for decades. These gates were not just entrances, they were primers on the consequences of dissent. The burning of so-called witches was not a private affair but a communal festival of purification, where the flames were meant to cleanse the social body of its perceived corruption, their smoke a signal of the community's renewed purity. Across the ocean, the Aztecs performed elaborate human sacrifices high upon their temple pyramids. The act of offering a heart to the gods was a cosmic transaction, a necessary ritual to ensure the sun would rise again. The torrents of blood flowing down the steppes were not waste. They were the sacred price of cosmic order, a brutal reaffirmation of a covenant between the people and their deities. In each case, the blood was never spilled in vain. It was a currency, a symbol traded for stability, power, and a very specific fear-based version of peace. One might assume that such barbaric spectacles are relics of a less enlightened past, that we have evolved beyond the need for such crude displays. But the language of symbolic violence has not disappeared. It has simply found new mediums, new amplifiers. The modern era has its own town squares and its own public gates. The 24-hour news cycle endlessly loops images of conflict and punishment, feeding a pervasive sense of threat. More disturbingly, the digital age has given rise to a new form of atrocity exhibition, the execution video, meticulously produced and broadcast by terrorist organizations. These are not recordings of killings that happen to be seen. They are killings designed to be seen. They are crafted with cinematic awareness, with specific angles, lighting, and messaging, to terrorize a global audience, to recruit the disaffected, and to project an image of ruthless power. Similarly, on a smaller but no less potent scale, criminal organizations use social media to broadcast their violence, a beating, a shooting, as a warning to rivals and a demonstration of control to their own communities. The platform has changed from the physical square to the digital feed, but the core message remains terrifyingly consistent. See what we can do. The act is not about eliminating one enemy. It is about intimidating 10,000 potential ones. This persistent human impulse to stage violence, to make a spectacle of suffering, forces us to confront a darker facet of our nature. If an act of ultimate cruelty can be so effectively repurposed into a message, then violence transcends the mere destruction of the body. It becomes a tool for manipulating the mind, for shaping the beliefs and behaviors of the living. It operates in the realm of psychology and symbolism, long after the physical act is complete. The true target is not the victim on the scaffold or in the video, but the witness. The power it seeks is not just over life and death, but over thought and fear. We have mastered the art of using death to make a point, of wielding agony as a persuasive argument. But in doing so, have we merely refined the club into a more precise instrument? Or have we, in our endless ingenuity, discovered that the most lasting wounds are not those inflicted on the flesh, but those etched into the collective imagination? If the staged violence of the powerful is a dark language of control, what then of the raw, chaotic violence that seems to erupt spontaneously between groups? If the public execution is a grimly organized play, is the perpetual skirmish in the jungle a more fundamental instinctual drama? The humid air of the Amazon is thick and heavy, a blanket of life and decay. It muffles sound, swallowing the calls of howler monkeys and the rustle of unseen creatures in the canopy. Yet, it cannot swallow the intent. A line of Yanomami men moves with a practiced ghostly silence through the emerald gloom. Their feet, broad and splayed, make no impression on the damp earth. They do not carry the tools of the hunt. Their bows are strung not for monkey or tapir, but for man. They are not seeking sustenance. They are seeking retribution. The target is a village, a collection of Shabonos just a day's travel away. Kin turned enemy over a slight, a stolen woman, a killing from a decade past that was itself a reprisal for something almost forgotten. The cycle is older than any living memory, a bitter heirloom passed down through generations. This is not war as the modern world knows it.
There is no declaration, no general, no grand ideology. It is a feud, a bloody, intimate, and perpetual dance of raid and reprisal. And it is a dance performed on every continent, in every isolated pocket of humanity, a chilling testament to a pattern etched deep into our social bones. From the dense, river-woven jungles of the Amazon to the cloud-shrouded, razor-backed highlands of Papua New Guinea, the same story is written in blood and fear. The Dani tribes, their bodies smeared with pig grease and ash, clashed over stolen pigs and garden boundaries. The Highland clans of Scotland, before the coming of empires, engaged in their cattle raids and border skirmishes. In the vast deserts of Australia and the plains of North America, the pattern held. Geographically severed, culturally distinct, these small-scale societies all converged on the same grim model of conflict. The tactics are universal. The dawn raid, the ambush along a forest path, the overwhelming of a small party. The objectives are grimly familiar: to kill the men, to capture the women and children, to seize whatever meager resources are at hand, and above all, to demonstrate strength and exact a price for past grievances. It is a politics of terror, where prestige is measured in the ability to inflict pain and avoid being victimized. The violence is not a sporadic outburst of savagery, but a calculated, integral part of the social fabric, a dark thread woven into the very cradle of community. Anthropological knowledge, built from decades of patient and often dangerous fieldwork, peels back the simplistic layers. It reveals that this perpetual state of low-grade warfare is rarely just about scarce resources. A contested hunting ground or a stolen axe might be the spark, but the fuel is made of more volatile stuff: honor, status, and reproductive strategy. In a world where one's security depends entirely on the strength and cohesion of one's immediate group, a reputation for ferocity is the best insurance policy. To show weakness is an invitation for predation. A successful raid proves the mettle of the warriors, solidifies alliances, and offers young men a path to status that is otherwise difficult to achieve. The captured women become wives, directly increasing the genetic and numerical strength of the victors. The calculus is brutal, Darwinian, and heartbreakingly effective. The casualty rates, when scaled to population size, often dwarf the horrors of modern industrial warfare. In these intimate conflicts, everyone is a soldier, and no one is a civilian. The entire world is the front line, and the war is never truly over. It only sleeps, waiting for the next remembered insult to wake it. And then we step back into our world of concrete and code. We look at the sprawling metropolis and believe we have transcended this ancient brutality. We have laws, police, international courts. Yet the old pattern whispers to us from the shadows of our own creations. The street gang defending its turf with lethal violence is not so different from a tribal war party defending its hunting grounds. The drive-by shooting is a technologically accelerated ambush. The internecine warfare of rival factions within a failed state, the sectarian violence that erupts along ancient fault lines, the online mobs that form with terrifying speed to destroy the reputation of an individual. These are all modern expressions of the same primordial script. We have not eliminated tribalism. We have merely fractalized it, allowing it to replicate infinitely in smaller, more chaotic units. The territory is no longer just a river valley. It is a city block, a market share, an ideological niche on social media. The weapons are words and algorithms as well as knives and bullets. Has the consolidation of power into nation-states actually reduced violence, or has it simply bottled the ancient, festering energy of intergroup rivalry into larger, more dangerous vessels, waiting for a crack to appear? If this model of perpetual small-scale conflict is so deeply embedded, so seemingly intrinsic to the way human groups organize and compete, what does that say about our prospects for peace? Is our civilization, with its complex legal frameworks and monumental institutions, nothing more than a thin veneer stretched taut over a churning primordial depth? Can we legislate our way out of an impulse that seems written into our very social DNA? Or does the change need to be deeper, slower, a fundamental evolution of culture itself? The law can punish the act of violence,
But can it extinguish the desire for dominance, the thirst for respect, the primal urge for retribution that fuels it? We have contained the tribe within the state, but have we tamed it, or merely given it a new, more powerful form? Perhaps the true transformation began not when we outlawed violence, but when we found a way to monetize it, to organize it, to give it a uniform and a banner. Imagine a quiet valley at dawn. The mist still clings to the river, and the air is cool. A group of men, their faces painted with the ochre of their clan, move in silence through the tall grass. Their objective is not conquest, but survival. A swift, brutal raid on a neighboring band for resources, for vengeance, for a handful of stolen women. The violence is intimate, immediate, and fleeting. It is a sharp, painful scratch on the skin of the world, one that bleeds, scabs over, and is forgotten until the next season's grievance. Now, shift the scene. The mist is replaced by the smoke of 1,000 campfires. The silence is broken by the rhythmic tramp of boots on packed earth, the clank of standardized armor, the distant call of a trumpet. The painted faces are gone, replaced by identical uniforms. The objective is no longer a simple raid, it is a campaign, a war. This violence is not a scratch. It is a deep, surgical incision, planned for months, funded by taxes and blessed by priests. It has a name, a budget, and an anthem. The intimate, chaotic violence of the tribe has been caged, tamed, and institutionalized by the nation-state. What profound shift in the human story allowed us to transform a bloody skirmish into a meticulously planned, long-term enterprise? This transition, from the ambush to the army, is inextricably linked to the very birth of the state. In small tribal societies, violence was a decentralized affair. Any faction or family could, in theory, initiate a conflict. But as human societies grew denser, more complex, and more hierarchical, a fundamental change occurred. The right to wield legitimate violence was slowly, inexorably, pulled from the hands of the many and concentrated into the hands of the few. The chaotic, personal feud between groups was gradually outlawed, replaced by the ordered, impersonal war between states. The state did not eliminate violence, it claimed a monopoly on it. The club was taken from every individual hand and placed into the single gloved fist of the sovereign. The sociologist Max Weber gave this transformation its clearest definition. A modern state is that which successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force *. This is not just a description of power, it is the very core of the state's identity. From the sprawling legions of ancient empires answerable only to their Caesar, to the national armies of today, sworn to defend a constitution, the principle holds. War ceased to be a spontaneous outburst and became a regulated institution. It required a formal declaration, a legal and rhetorical framing of the enemy as an unjust aggressor. It demanded a clear chain of command, turning the act of killing from a personal choice into a duty to one's country. Most significantly, it necessitated the total mobilization of society, its wealth, its industry, and the hearts and minds of its people. The farmer was asked to give his grain, the factory worker her labor, and the mother her son, all for a cause that was now defined as greater than any individual life. This institutionalization of violence has reshaped its very character, wrapping it in layers of ritual and meaning that would be utterly alien to our tribal ancestors. Today's violence is administered. It is a bureaucracy of death. Soldiers are given uniforms, not just for protection, but to erase their individuality and mark them as instruments of the state's will. Their actions are governed by thick manuals of law and conduct. Their deaths are commemorated in solemn ceremonies. They are given titles: hero, martyr, patriot, while the enemy dead are labeled terrorists, insurgents, or traitors. The violence is even sanitized for public consumption, broadcast on live television and discussed by pundits in studios far from the mud and blood of the battlefield.
The raw, terrifying act of killing is hidden behind the cool, abstract language of collateral damage, theater of operations, and strategic assets. The club has been polished, engraved with a national seal, and placed on a velvet cushion. But is it any less a club? We tell ourselves this is progress, that this monopolization and regulation of violence is the foundation of civilization, the very thing that protects us from the brutal chaos of a world where every man is a law unto himself. Our children are taught from a young age to revere the flag, to honor the military, and to believe that the ultimate sacrifice one can make is to die for one's country. This belief is the bedrock of the modern social contract. Yet, this ritualized, state-sanctioned violence can achieve a scale of destruction that our tribal ancestors could not have conceived in their most terrifying nightmares. The raid might claim 12 lives. The modern war claims millions. So, have we truly tamed the beast of violence, or have we merely given it a larger cage and taught it to follow orders? If every nation, regardless of its ideology or creed, teaches its children the same fundamental lesson, that defending the homeland is a sacred duty worth a river of blood, then what has really changed? Have we, in our long journey from tribe to nation, merely traded one set of flags for another, while the ancient, grim dance of conflict continues on a grander, more terrifying stage? And if this capacity for organized, large-scale violence is now woven into the fabric of our societies, one must wonder from where this thread first originated. Did we invent it, or were we merely building upon a foundation laid down much, much deeper in our past? What if the instinct to band together and do violence to the other is not a cultural innovation, but an evolutionary heirloom passed down through millennia? Is it possible that our monuments and our armies are not just products of history, but also of biology? A dark inheritance from ancestors for whom violence was not just a tool for survival, but a part of their very identity. The fire crackles, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough stone of the cave wall. A small group of hominids, Homo erectus, huddles close, their features sharp and alien in the flickering light. Their focus is not on the flames, but on what lies broken before them. The bones are large, too large for a gazelle or boar. The proportions are unsettlingly familiar, a femur, a skull fractured open. With practiced strikes of a sharp stone, they tap, tap, tap against the larger bones, not for the meat, but for the treasure within, the rich, fatty marrow. And the most profound, the most uncomfortable truth of this scene is not the act itself, but the simple, unassailable fact that we are their descendants. This is a part of our inheritance, written not in stone, but in the very code of our being. This behavior, which we now call cannibalism, is not a grotesque anomaly in the human story. It is a thread, dark and strong, woven deep into the fabric of our prehistory. The evidence is etched into the fossil record, a silent testimony across species. Homo antecessor, in what is now Spain, their bones bearing the same cut marks as the animal bones beside them. Neanderthals in caves across Europe, their remains suggesting not just consumption, but perhaps ritual. Early Homo sapiens, in corners of the globe from the forests of Europe to the highlands of Papua New Guinea, all pointing to a past where the line between predator and prey could blur within the same species. This was not an isolated horror. It was, in certain times and under certain desperate stars, a viable strategy. A grim logic of survival in a world where calories were currency and extinction lurked in every shadow. The most compelling evidence, however, does not come from stones and bones alone. It comes from us, from the biological legacy we carry within every cell. Geneticists, mapping the vast landscape of our DNA, have stumbled upon peculiar markers. Certain alleles, certain versions of genes, appear to have been selected for. They provided such a powerful advantage that they spread through populations. One such advantage was a resistance to prion diseases, a class of fatal neurodegenerative disorders akin to mad cow disease. These diseases can be transmitted through the consumption of neural tissue, especially the brain.
The prevalence of these protective genes in the human genome suggests a startling history, that the practice of eating human brain tissue was once common enough and went on for long enough to exert a significant evolutionary pressure. Our ancestors who possessed a genetic resistance to the ensuing prion diseases survived to pass on their genes. Those who did not perished. Our very biology, then, carries the ghostly imprint of this ancient practice. It is a monument in our molecules to a past we would rather forget. And so we arrive at the modern world, with its cities of glass and steel, its laws and its taboos. We have collectively agreed that the consumption of human flesh is the ultimate transgression, the absolute boundary of the uncivilized. We have pushed that particular aspect of our heritage into the deepest shadows, condemning it as the act of monsters and madmen. Yet, if we have ostensibly abandoned the most literal form of intraspecies violence, have we truly transcended the impulse? The evidence suggests otherwise. We no longer gather around a fire to break the bones of our rivals, but we design ever more efficient ways to break their bodies and their spirits. War, organized and mechanized, remains a constant of human history. Violent crime, hatred that festers into brutality, systemic oppression, these are the modern vessels for an ancient cargo. We have not eliminated the predatory impulse. We have simply ritualized it, bureaucratized it, and given it new, more complex justifications. The club has become a drone strike. The act of consuming a rival's strength has become the act of consuming their resources, their land, their autonomy. This leads us to a quiet, unsettling crossroads of thought. If the capacity for violence, even of this most extreme kind, is so deeply embedded in our story that it has shaped our evolution, what does that mean for our nature? Is it a dormant relic, a vestigial impulse like an appendix, mostly harmless until it becomes inflamed? Or is it a fundamental, indelible part of our wiring, a low hum in the background of our consciousness that is constantly being managed, suppressed, and redirected by the thin veneer of civilization? We like to believe that our morality, our empathy, our reason are the true essence of humanity. But what if they are the magnificent, hard-won additions, the beautiful carvings on a much older, much darker stone? The potential for profound compassion and the capacity for extreme brutality seem to share a common ancestry. Two sides of the same coin minted millions of years ago on the savannah. We contain both the hand that offers help and the hand that wields the weapon. The question is not which one is more real, but what delicate balance of circumstance and choice determines which one we ultimately extend. And if this ancient inheritance is indeed a whisper in our blood, what is the trigger, the key that turns the lock? What alchemy of biology and environment transforms a thought into an act, a potential into a reality? What is the hidden chemistry that can make a protector become a predator, that can make a nurturing impulse curdle into a destructive one? A single chemical surge, a tide of molecules flooding the bloodstream, enough, in the right context, to transform a quiet teacher into a killer, a peaceful man into a weapon. This is not magic, but endocrinology. It is the hidden current of aggression, and its most famous ambassador is testosterone. For centuries, this hormone has been synonymous with masculinity itself, lauded as the biological bedrock of strength, resilience, and competitive fire. But every force casts a shadow. The very same chemical that drives ambition and courage also whispers of a darker potential, a primal readiness for violence that lies coiled within, waiting for the right provocation to strike. Imagine the electric atmosphere of a major sporting event, seconds before the starting whistle. The air is thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that is not just psychological, but physiological. Studies have shown that in male athletes, testosterone levels begin to spike dramatically mere minutes before a competition. The heart pounds harder, muscles tense, and focus narrows to a laser point. This is the body priming itself for battle, marshaling its resources for the contest ahead. But the hormone's influence doesn't stop at the boundary of the bicep or the quadricep. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, seeping into the very seat of consciousness and decision-making. It alters the calculus of the mind. The question shifts from a complex assessment of strategy and risk to a far simpler, more ancient binary: to strike or not to strike. This hormonal wave doesn't create aggression from nothing, but it dramatically lowers the threshold for it, turning a spark of irritation into a roaring flame. We have long wrapped testosterone in a cultural narrative of heroic virtue. It is the invisible essence of the stoic hero, the determined explorer, the relentless innovator. It is the drive to build, to conquer, to protect. This story is not entirely wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. This biological signal is fundamentally one of sensitivity. It makes the individual exquisitely, sometimes dangerously, attuned to challenges. It is a chemical radar for disrespect, for a slight to one's status, for a threat to one's place in the hierarchy. In the stressful, perceivedly threatening environments where our ancient brains often still believe we reside, testosterone doesn't just suggest a response, it demands one. It pushes the neural circuitry away from flight, away from freeze, and squarely toward fight. It is the chemical embodiment of the old adage: the best defense is a good offense. This is the predator's edge, the instinct to lash out first and ask questions later, a trait that was once crucial for survival, but now often spells disaster in a world of complex social rules and fragile peace. This ancient programming collides violently with our modern world. The archetype of the tough man, the one who never backs down, who meets force with greater force, is still celebrated, even rewarded, in countless arenas. On the schoolyard, the boy who fights back is often seen as stronger than the one who seeks mediation. In the corporate boardroom or in politics, aggressive, domineering behavior is frequently mistaken for decisive leadership. On social media, platforms are designed to amplify outrage and tribal loyalty, creating perpetual states of artificial conflict where testosterone-fueled instincts for defending one's in-group are constantly triggered. The price of this celebration is the normalization of aggression. It teaches that violence is a valid, even admirable tool for conflict resolution. It equates emotional restraint with weakness and glorifies the extreme competitor who crushes all opposition, leaving a trail of psychological wreckage in his wake. We have built ecosystems that not only tolerate this darker side of masculinity, but actively fertilize it, all while pretending to be surprised by the toxic fruit it bears. So if testosterone is the potent fuel, the accelerant poured on the smoldering embers of anger, what serves as the brake? Is it sheer force of will, a conscious mind struggling against a primal tide? Is it education and socialization teaching young boys to recognize the chemical heat rising within them and to choose a different path? Or is the solution more profound? Does it require us to redesign the very ecosystems we inhabit? Perhaps true control isn't about fighting our biology, but about changing the rules of the game so that men are no longer forced to constantly prove their worth, their strength, their very identity through symbolic or literal violence. What if the ultimate measure of strength wasn't the power to dominate, but the power to restrain, the very impulse to do so? This line of questioning inevitably leads us to a deeper, more unsettling layer. For not every man reacts to this hormonal tide in the same way. Some navigate the current with grace, while others are swiftly pulled under by its riptide. This variance suggests that the story is far more complex than a single hormone. The fuel may be universal, but the engine it feeds is built from a unique blueprint, written in a code that is handed down from generation to generation. If testosterone provides the opportunity for violence, what is it that creates the predisposition? Could it be that some are, from their very first breath, engineered for a different kind of struggle? We are not all born the same. Some are born with a greater capacity for violence than others. This is not a comfortable truth, but one that science, in its slow and meticulous way, has begun to illuminate. Consider a study of 900 pairs of twins, a natural experiment in the interplay of nature and nurture. It found that aggressive behavior can be up to 50% heritable. The number hangs in the air, heavy with implication. What does it really mean to say that violence can be inherited? It suggests that deep within the blueprint of a life, written in a chemical code shared and shuffled through generations? There might be inclinations, proclivities, a whisper of a shadow that is not yet a deed. For a long time, we explained brutality solely through the lens of environment. A violent father begets a violent son because the son learned it, because he was abused, because he was poor, because he was desperate. These reasons remain powerfully, undeniably true, but they are not the whole story. The narrative is more complex, woven from both the circumstances of our lives and the biology of our bodies. Genetics provides the raw material, the clay from which a self is sculpted. Environment is the hand of the sculptor. Some clay is more malleable, some more brittle, some more prone to cracking under pressure. This is the realm of behavioral genetics, a field that moves beyond simple cause and effect into a landscape of probabilities and vulnerabilities. Here we find genes with names like MAOA, often dubbed the warrior gene, which plays a crucial role in breaking down neurotransmitters like a janitor cleaning up after a storm of signals in the brain. Certain variants of this gene mean the cleanup is less efficient, the storm's debris lingers longer. Or the serotonin transporter gene, which governs the mood-stabilizing chemical serotonin, a molecule of peace and regulation. A shorter version of this gene can mean a lower tolerance for stress, a quicker trip to the cliff's edge of anger. Then there is dopamine, the molecule of reward and pursuit whose receptors can vary in their sensitivity, perhaps making the thrill of a confrontation more potent, more addictive. These are not genes for violence. They are genes for sensitivity, for impulsivity, for how we process threat and reward. They are dials that can be turned up or down by the world. This genetic knowledge paints a picture not of destiny, but of differential susceptibility. A person carrying a particular variant of the MAOA gene might walk through a peaceful, supportive childhood and emerge as a passionate advocate, a fearless leader, their inner fire channeled into ambition rather than aggression. Their biology is not a curse, but a potential. But place that same genetic makeup into the crucible of severe childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, relentless fear, and the combination can be explosive. The genetic predisposition interacts with the environment in a terrible synergy. The brain, shaped by both a vulnerable genome and a hostile world, adapts for that world. It becomes hypervigilant, quick to perceive threat, swift to retaliate. It learns that violence is not just an option, but a necessary currency of survival. The potential for a deep, resonant anger was always there, sleeping in the genes. The trauma is the alarm clock that jolts it awake. So, is it nature or nurture? The question itself becomes obsolete. It is always both, a constant, inseparable dance between the inherited self and the experienced world. This new understanding ripples out, forcing us to re-examine the very pillars of our society. In a courtroom, how do we judge a defendant whose actions were influenced by a genetic makeup they did not choose, combined with a childhood they did not control? Does it absolve them of responsibility or simply complicate our understanding of it? In medicine and education, this knowledge opens doors to profound early intervention. If we can identify children who are neurobiologically more vulnerable to developing antisocial behaviors, we can, in theory, pour resources into their lives, providing stable, nurturing, and predictable environments that can effectively counterweight their genetic leanings. We can teach emotional regulation as a core skill, building the cognitive levees to hold back the flood of impulse. But this hopeful possibility is shadowed by a dark and familiar danger. What happens when we start labeling a child as having a violence gene? Does that become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Does it lead to support or to stigma? Do we create a new underclass, judged not for their actions but for their alleles, their potential for crime assessed from a saliva swab? The tool of understanding is razor sharp. It can precisely cut away ignorance, or it can inflict a deep and lasting wound. So we are left standing at a crossroads, holding a map of the human genome that is both illuminating and deeply unsettling. If a propensity for aggression is woven into our very biological fabric, not as a certainty but as a tilted scale, how then do we assign moral blame? Can we condemn a man for his anger if his brain is fundamentally less equipped to soothe it? Or does our humanity reside precisely in our ability to rise above our baser biology, to use the conscious, reasoning parts of our mind to override the ancient, impulsive whispers from below? The law requires a guilty mind, a conscious choice to do wrong. But what if the mind itself is not entirely free? We are left not with an answer, but with a more difficult, more nuanced question. We are forced to look beyond the simple binary of good and evil, into the intricate machinery of behavior, where a million tiny parts, genes, synapses, childhood experiences, traumatic moments, click together to form a single, fateful decision. And in that moment of decision, when the air grows thick with threat, another ancient system awakens, one that operates on a logic far older than morality. What happens when the body decides to kill first and ask questions never? You hear a rustle in the bushes. Your hand clenches into a fist. No thought is required. It is instinct. Our ancestors lived in a world where danger could emerge from anywhere. A predator's shadow, a rival's snarl, the silent threat of a stranger in the night. To survive in that long twilight, they honed a simple, brutal strategy. When in doubt, strike first. Hesitation was a luxury paid for in blood. This ancient impulse, carved into the very bedrock of our neurology, is a ghost that still walks among us, a relic in a world it no longer recognizes. Imagine the savannah, a vast golden cradle of life and death. For a hominid, every shadow could conceal a leopard, every snapped twig signal an ambush. In this theater of survival, the brain's oldest sentinel, the amygdala, became the undisputed master of ceremonies. It operates on a timescale that shames conscious thought, processing potential threats in milliseconds. It is the architect of the cascade we now call fight or flight, a symphony of stress hormones, redirected blood flow, and heightened senses that once meant the difference between returning to the clan or becoming a feast for scavengers. This system is not designed for accuracy, but for speed. It is better to mistake a harmless vine for a snake 100 times than to mistake a snake for a vine just once. This is the evolutionary calculus of fear, a bargain struck in blood and time. This knowledge changes how we see a flinch, a sudden anger, an unspoken prejudice. That reflexive overdefensiveness is not a moral failing in the moment, but the echo of a survival mechanism that served us too well for too long. It is the neurological equivalent of a hair trigger, set in an era of clear and present dangers. In the absence of saber-tooths, the mechanism now misfires, interpreting a stranger's unfamiliar gait, a different accent, or a sudden movement in a pocket as a modern proxy for an ancient threat. The system that once helped us navigate a world of predators and prey now misfires in a world of social nuance and complex human identities, transforming difference into danger and misunderstanding into conflict. We see the price of this ancient wiring everywhere in our modern tapestry. A police officer, their primal alarm screaming, makes a split-second decision that a community mourns for years. A minor traffic dispute escalates from a honked horn to a fistfight as two modern humans are hijacked by a feud that belongs on a prehistoric trail. We see it in the instinctive distrust of the other, in the tribalistic us versus them narratives that course through our politics and our neighborhoods. These are not merely social problems. They are, at their core, biological ones. They are tragedies written by a modern script, but directed by a primordial part of our brain, a part that never truly left the wilderness. We carry the savannah within us, and sometimes it spills out onto the city street. So where does this leave us? Creatures of consciousness trapped in bodies wired for a vanished world? If our hardware is still essentially Paleolithic, can we ever truly rewrite its operating system? Can we teach this ancient, fearful heart to beat in time with a world of abstract rules and profound interconnection? We attempt to train it, to layer civility over instinct, to appeal to the newer rational cortex to veto the old, screaming amygdala. We create laws, foster empathy, and preach tolerance, all noble efforts to build a levee against the primal flood. But the levee is always under pressure. The ghost is always there, waiting for a moment of stress, of fatigue, of fear, to remind us of its enduring power. We are living a paradox, using our sophisticated forebrains to constantly manage the fallout from our ancient hindbrains. The cost is a constant low-grade friction in the human experience. We are forever apologizing for our instincts, forever trying to explain the unexplainable surge of rage on a crowded subway, the irrational fear of a harmless stranger. We are beings perpetually caught between two worlds, forever paying a kind of psychic tax for a safety system that is both obsolete and indispensable. We have tamed our environment with stunning speed, but we have not yet tamed the wilderness within. The question is not whether we can erase this instinct. It is woven into the fabric of our survival. But whether we can learn to hear its alarm without always obeying its command. Perhaps the real journey is not about silencing the ghost, but about learning to listen to its warning without handing it the sword. It is about recognizing that the rustle in the bushes is almost always just the wind, yet understanding why we still jump. This deep, ingrained programming for preemptive violence is our inheritance. It is the club we inherited from our ancestors, a tool that saved lives, but is now too often a weapon against our own humanity. We must ask ourselves, can we honor the club's purpose without feeling compelled to use it? And if we can learn to manage the battlefield within a single heart, what then of the collective, amplified violence we unleash upon each other? When we scale this individual instinct for preemptive strike to the level of nations, arm it with technology that operates at the speed of light, and divorce the act of violence from its human consequence, what new, more profound price must we pay?